Victor Hale grabbed Evelyn's wrist so hard she felt the bones grind together. He didn't raise his voice. Men like Victor never needed to. He simply leaned in close, close enough that she could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath, and said, "You belong to me. Your father signed the papers. That makes you mine. And if you run again—" He tightened his grip, his eyes cold and entirely certain. "I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in a cell that makes this look like a palace." He dropped her wrist and straightened his coat. Then he smiled. That was the worst part. The smile. Like breaking a person was just another Tuesday. That was the moment Evelyn Mercer stopped waiting for someone to save her. She ran. 32 miles through Colorado wilderness with nothing but cracked boots, a travel bag, and a name everyone in 3 counties already believed was dirty. And that night, kneeling beside the cold wooden frame of a stranger's bunk, when she thought every soul on Stone Ridge Ranch was asleep, she prayed. Not loudly, barely a whisper. But in the silence of that ranch house, one man heard every word. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do, you already know exactly how this story feels. And if you haven't, stay with us, because by the end you'll understand why some people are worth fighting for. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, please subscribe and follow along to the end. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The last mile nearly finished her. Evelyn had stopped counting the miles somewhere around the 3rd creek crossing when her right boot had split along the sole, and every step after that turned into a small private negotiation between her body and her will. The Colorado afternoon had been brutal when she'd started out, but the sun had gone down mean and fast, and by the time the wooden gate posts of Stone Ridge Ranch appeared through the tree line, she wasn't walking so much as refusing to stop. She stood at the gate for longer than she should have. Long enough that her legs began to shake in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The sign overhead was burned wood, rough letters, Stone Ridge Ranch, and beneath it, nailed crooked and sun-bleached, a smaller board, "Trespassers will be dealt with." It wasn't a welcome. It wasn't meant to be. But there was lamplight in the main house window, and lamplight meant people, and people meant the small chance that hadn't entirely died in her chest yet. She pushed the gate open. It creaked like it wanted to announce her. She let it. The yard between the gate and the porch steps was not a short walk. She crossed it anyway, past a horse trough that needed repair, past a pile of fence posts stacked and waiting, past the smell of hay and animals and something frying inside the house that made her stomach clench so hard her vision blurred for a second. She hadn't eaten since the bread she'd stolen from her own pocket. Bread she'd bought herself, she reminded herself bitterly, with her own money, from a town that had already decided she was a thief. She climbed the porch steps. The second one cracked under her weight, but held. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again, harder. Her knuckles hurt. The door opened about 4 inches, blocked by a thick arm, and the face that looked out at her was not a kind one. Not cruel either, just suspicious, the way men who've seen enough hard country get suspicious of anything unexpected. He was broad through the shoulders, dark-haired but heavily salted at the temples, and his eyes did what eyes do when they take in a woman who looks exactly like she's been walking all day through rough terrain. They assessed, calculated, and narrowed. "Help you?" His voice came out flat. Not unfriendly, just flat. "I'm looking for work," Evelyn said. He looked at her travel bag, then at her boot, the one with the split sole, then back at her face. "Ranch ain't hiring." He started to close the door and she put her hand against it. Not aggressive, just there. A small act that surprised even her. "I cook," she said. "I clean. I can work in a garden, tend animals, keep accounts if you need it. I'm not asking for much, just somewhere to sleep that isn't open sky and enough to eat to keep working. That's all." He didn't open the door wider, but he didn't push it closed either. "Who are you?" "Evelyn Mercer." Something moved across his face, something she recognized because she'd been watching for it everywhere she went these past 4 months. The flicker of recognition. The moment the name landed somewhere, he'd already heard it. "Mercer," he repeated. "Yes. From Caulfield County." Her jaw tightened. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamplight from inside caught the edge of his jaw, and she could see it working, the slow grind of a man weighing something he hadn't expected to have to weigh tonight. There's a story going around, he said carefully, about a woman named Mercer from Caulfield County. Doesn't speak well of her. No, Evelyn said, it doesn't. You going to tell me the story's wrong? I'm going to tell you that the man who started that story put his hand on me when I told him not to, and when I walked away from him, he decided that the easiest way to keep himself looking clean was to make me look dirty. She met his eyes. Her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. I can't make you believe that. I won't try. But I'm standing here asking for a chance to work, not a declaration of innocence. Whether you believe me is your business. Whether I can do the job is mine. He stared at her. She stared back. The door opened. He was taller than she'd estimated. Silas Rowan was not a man built for small rooms. He filled the doorway in a way that made the frame seem decorative, and up close his face showed the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Not old tired, just used tired, like a man who'd been carrying weight so long he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like empty. Come inside, he said, before you fall down on my porch. She followed him. The house was what she'd expected and not what she'd expected. It was clean, not spotless, but honestly clean. The kind of clean a man manages when he cares about order even if no one's taught him the shortcuts. But it was empty in ways that cleaning couldn't fix. The kitchen had good bones and neglected follow-through. The table had 4 chairs and only one of them looked regularly used. There were hooks by the door with one coat on them instead of several. And that one detail, one coat, one pair of boots beside the door, told Evelyn more about this man than anything he'd said. Sit down before you fall down, he said again, because apparently once wasn't enough to convince her. She sat. He put a plate in front of her without asking what she wanted, because the answer was obvious, and she ate without the performance of politeness because she was too far past performance. The food was simple: beef, potatoes, something that might have been gravy in an earlier life, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in she couldn't remember how long. She caught herself eating too fast and forced herself to slow down. Silas Rowan sat across from her with a cup of coffee and watched her with the patience of a man who'd learned that watching told you more than asking. You walked from where? He finally said. Tolliston. Before that, Harker's Bluff. Before that, Caulfield. He did the math with his eyes. That's not a short road. No. Why Tolliston? Why not somewhere bigger? Denver. Further along. Evelyn set her fork down for a moment. Because Denver talks to Caulfield. Bigger towns talk to each other. Victor Hale has money, and money has long arms. Smaller stops seemed safer until I found... She paused. Until I found something solid. Silas turned his cup in a slow circle. Who's Victor Hale? The name sat between them like a rock dropped in water, and Evelyn watched the ripples reach him. The man whose story you already heard, she said. His version of it. Silence. The kind that has weight. My wife passed 3 years ago, Silas said, which seemed like a complete change of subject until it wasn't. Been running this place short-handed since. I've got 7 ranch hands and no one who does what she used to do. Keeping the house, keeping the kitchen, keeping... He stopped. Keeping things from going gray. He looked at her. That probably sounds strange. It doesn't, Evelyn said, and she meant it. He was quiet again. There's a room off the kitchen, he said at last. Small. Stays warm because of the stove. You can have it tonight. In the morning, we'll see how you work. Evelyn looked at him. She wanted to ask why. Why he was doing this. Why he'd let her in when the name Mercer had clearly registered as a warning. But she'd learned the long way that some questions push people back inside themselves. Thank you, she said instead. He nodded once. Don't thank me yet. The room off the kitchen was exactly what he'd said. Small, warm, with a narrow bunk along one wall and a hook on the back of the door. Evelyn set her travel bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bunk, and waited for the feeling to catch up to the situation. It usually came delayed, the relief, or the fear, or whatever it was going to be. She'd learned not to rush it. What came instead was exhaustion so complete it almost felt like peace, but she didn't lie down right away. She knelt beside the bunk. Old habit. Something her mother had done and her mother before that, and Evelyn had kept it even when she'd stopped believing all the things that used to go along with it. It was less about the words now and more about the posture. The act of making herself small and still on purpose, in a world that had been making her small against her will. She didn't say much, kept it low, kept it plain. Just, please, let this be real. Let this hold. I'm so tired of running. I'll work. I'll earn it. Just let this hold. She didn't hear the footsteps stop outside the door. She didn't hear the quiet that stretched on longer than a man just passing through would need. She didn't know until much later that Silas Rowan had been on his way to check the stove latch before bed, had heard the barely there sound of a voice in the room off the kitchen, and had stood with his hand an inch from the door handle long enough to hear something that rearranged several things inside him that he'd thought were fixed in place for good. He walked away without knocking, went to bed, and didn't sleep. Morning came hard and early at Stone Ridge Ranch, the way it always did, and Evelyn was up before it. She'd lain awake most of the night anyway. Not from worry, which surprised her, but from a kind of stunned stillness, like a person who's been running so long they don't know what to do when the ground levels out. She found the kitchen by feel in the gray dark and started figuring it out the way she always figured out new kitchens, methodically, quietly, touching things to understand them. The stove needed coaxing. The flour bin was lower than it should be. Someone had stacked the pans in an order that made no practical sense. She reorganized them before she thought better of it, then decided not to apologize for it. By the time the sun cleared the ridgeline, there was coffee on the stove, biscuits in the oven, and the kind of smell coming through the house that makes people wake up slightly less hostile. Silas came into the kitchen at 6 and stopped. He looked at the table. He looked at the stove. He looked at Evelyn, who was cutting something at the counter with her back to him, and he stood there long enough that she heard him. "Morning," she said without turning around. "You didn't have to—" "I know." She glanced back. "But I'm asking you to let me work, not let me board. There's a difference." He sat down, pulled a cup toward him. Something crossed his face that she couldn't fully read. Not gratitude exactly, but something older than gratitude. Something closer to recognition. The ranch hands came in at 6:30, and they were exactly what she expected, and exactly what she hadn't expected. 7 men ranging from a boy who couldn't have been more than 16 to a sun-dried veteran named Cleet, who looked like he'd been left out in weather since before the territory was settled. They came through the door in various states of wakefulness, registered her presence with varying degrees of surprise and wariness, and sat down. She put food in front of them. They ate. The silence that followed wasn't unfriendly. It was the silence of people who hadn't expected something and were quietly deciding what to do about it. Cleet spoke first. He was that kind of man. "You the new cook?" "Looks that way," Evelyn said. "Where you from?" "East of here." Cleet considered this. "Long way to walk for a cook job?" "Yes," she said. "It was." He nodded slowly, like she'd answered a different question, and went back to his biscuit. The boy, whose name she'd learned was Danny, watched her with the open, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned that staring was rude. She caught him at it and raised her eyebrows. He turned red and looked at his plate. She had to work not to smile. Silas didn't say much at breakfast. He ate, listened to the morning talk about fences and weather and the north pasture drainage problem, and once, just once, his eyes crossed to where Evelyn stood at the stove and held there for a half-second longer than accidental. She was looking the other direction and didn't see it. The first week was a test she didn't know she was taking. Not set by Silas, he wasn't that kind of man, but set by the ranch itself and by the 7 men who moved through it and by the 1,000 small ways a place decides whether you belong in it or not. She felt it in every room she walked into, every task she picked up without being asked. Every morning she started before anyone else, and every night she stayed up patching what needed patching. She found the garden on the 3rd day, or what had been a garden, a plot along the south side of the house that someone had once cared about, and no one had touched in, judging by the state of it, at least 2 seasons. She pulled weeds for 3 hours on her afternoon break without saying anything about it. The next morning she was up earlier than usual because there were seeds in the storage room, and she had an idea about the radishes. Silas found her on her knees in the dirt at 5:45 in the morning. He stood at the side of the house for a moment before she noticed him. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She sat back on her heels. "My mother grew radishes, the fast kind. You can get a crop in 3 weeks if the ground cooperates." She looked at the plot. "Your soil's decent. It'll cooperate." He was quiet. Then, "She grew things here too, same spot." Evelyn looked up at him. She didn't ask who, she didn't need to. She just nodded and turned back to the ground. He went inside. When he came out to start the day's work, he didn't mention it again. But she noticed, without appearing to notice, that he walked that side of the house on his way to the barn now, instead of the other way, which added 30 unnecessary steps to his route. She said nothing about that either. The 9th day was the first time trouble arrived. It came in the form of a rider, dusty, fast, not from the area, who pulled up at the gate mid-morning while most of the hands were on the far pasture. Only Danny was in the yard, and Evelyn was on the porch shaking out a rug, and so they both heard it when the man called out in a carrying voice, "Looking for a woman goes by Mercer, Evelyn Mercer. Got a message from people who want her found." Danny looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the rider. She set the rug down on the porch rail, slow and deliberate, the way she'd learned to do things when her hands wanted to shake, and she refused to let them. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said. The rider looked her over. He had the manner of a hired man doing a hired man's job. No particular malice, but no particular conscience either. "Message is simple. You're wanted back in Caulfield County. The gentleman who has a legal claim on your whereabouts is prepared to be reasonable about the manner of your return." Something inside Evelyn went very still. "Tell him," she said, "that I'm working, and that whatever claim he thinks he has isn't what the law would call legal." The rider's eyes sharpened slightly. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, which he held out toward her. "He figured you'd say something like that. This is the documentation." She was off the porch before she'd decided to move. She crossed the yard and took the envelope, opened it, read what was inside. By the time she got to the 3rd paragraph, her hands had gone cold. It was a contract, or what was dressed up to look like one. Her father's signature at the bottom, she recognized it, though it looked shaky and wrong. And Victor Hale's name at the top, and language in the middle that turned her stomach because she understood enough of it to know exactly what it was trying to accomplish. It claimed a formal arrangement. It named a debt. It referenced a repayment schedule that included, and this was the part where the cold in her hands moved up to her chest, her ongoing service to the Hale household as a method of settlement. She looked up at the rider. "This isn't legal," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "That's for the courts to decide," he said pleasantly. "He just wanted you to know it exists." He touched his hat, turned his horse, rode back the way he'd come. Danny appeared at her elbow, all 16 anxious years of him. "Miss Mercer, what was that?" Evelyn folded the envelope and put it in her apron pocket. Her hands had stopped being cold. They'd moved on to a low, quiet anger that she recognized as more dangerous than fear because it was cleaner and it lasted longer. "Nothing that changes today's work," she said. That evening, after the hands had cleared out and the kitchen was put to rights, she went to find Silas. He was in the main room with what looked like account books and the specific posture of a man who'd rather be anywhere else than looking at account books. She put the envelope on the table in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. "What's this?" "Something you need to know about," she said, "if you're going to make an honest decision about whether I stay." He opened it, read it. His face while he read was harder to decipher than she'd expected. Not anger, not calculation, but something slower and more serious. He read it twice. Then he set it down, flattened it with his palm like he was trying to press it smaller. "You didn't steal anything," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "And this?" He gestured at the document. "This is him trying to use paper to do what he couldn't do in person." "Yes." Silas sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling, then at the window, and Evelyn got the feeling he was having some kind of internal conversation with himself that he'd arrived at before she'd walked in the room. Like he'd already known something was coming and was just waiting to find out what shape it wore. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want the honest answer even if you think it'll change things." "All right." He looked at her directly. Is he dangerous? Evelyn didn't hesitate. Yes. Silas nodded. The way he nodded told her that yes had been the answer he was prepared for. It also told her, in the quiet certainty of it, that prepared was a different thing than deterred. Then you stay, he said, and we figure out what to do about the paper. She hadn't expected it to land the way it did. She'd expected relief or suspicion or the complicated middle ground she'd been navigating for months. What she hadn't expected was the sudden, embarrassing, very real threat of tears that she shut down immediately and ruthlessly and hoped he hadn't seen. He'd seen. He was looking at his account books again, which was how she knew. I'll get the morning coffee started earlier than usual, she said, because it was the only sentence she trusted herself with. Good idea, he said to the account books. She went back to the kitchen, stood at the window for a moment, looking at the dark yard and the darker ridgeline above it. The envelope was still on the table behind her, still flat under Silas Rowan's palm, where he'd pressed it like something he could hold down by force. She'd spent 4 months being afraid of that piece of paper. Standing here, in this kitchen, with a man in the next room who'd just said, "You stay," like it was a simple sentence. She was still afraid. She wasn't naive enough to pretend otherwise. Victor Hale didn't send letters and ride away. Victor Hale sent letters to see what moved, and then he moved on whatever moved. But the fear felt different now. Not smaller. Just shared. And that was something she hadn't had in a very long time. Through the wall, she heard Silas turn a page in the account book. Then stop. Then not turn another one for a long time. Outside, the Colorado sky had cleared and was doing the thing it did this high up, blazing cold and enormous with more stars than any reasonable sky needed, and Evelyn stood at the window and looked at it and thought, for the first time since Caulfield County, maybe, just maybe. She didn't know that on the other side of that wall, Silas Rowan had stopped pretending to look at the account books and was sitting very still, thinking about footsteps he'd stopped outside a door 9 nights ago, and a voice barely louder than breathing, and the words he hadn't meant to hear that had nonetheless lodged somewhere between his ribs where he had not been able to dislodge them since. He'd heard plenty of prayers in his life, spoken plenty himself. In the years before, the grief made them feel like letters to an empty address. But he hadn't heard one like that, raw like a scrape, quiet like something meant for no audience, honest in the way that only comes when a person believes no one is listening. Please, let this hold. I'm so tired of running. He hadn't knocked on that door, hadn't gone in, had gone to bed and lain there and told himself it was none of his business. Now he sat with a false document on his table and a woman in his kitchen who'd walked 32 miles to ask for a chance. And he thought about the way she'd set the rug down on the porch rail before she crossed the yard to face that rider. Slow, deliberate, like someone who'd decided not to run even when running would have been easier. He thought about the radishes. He closed the account book. Something that had been sealed for 3 years was not, tonight, entirely sealed. He wasn't sure yet what to do about that. He was a careful man. He'd always been a careful man, which was sometimes a strength and sometimes just another word for slow. But he was sure about this. She stayed. And whoever came to change that would have to go through Stone Ridge Ranch to do it. The radishes came up on the 22nd day. Evelyn found them in the early morning, the way she found most things worth finding, alone, before anyone else was looking. Small green shoots pushing through the turned soil, stubborn and unremarkable and exactly what she'd said they'd be. She crouched beside the garden plot for a long moment, her coffee going cold in her hand, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Something that wasn't relief exactly, more like confirmation, like the ground itself was telling her, you were right to stay. She didn't tell anyone about the radishes. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because some things needed to be held privately a little longer before they could survive being shared. The ranch had been changing around her in the way that slow things change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but accumulating. The kitchen ran better now. The hands ate better. Danny had stopped being so watchful around her and had started leaving his muddy boots outside the door without being asked, which she suspected had more to do with Cleet setting him straight than with her, but she appreciated it either way. Cleet himself remained a sealed box, as sun-dried and uncommunicative as the first morning, but she'd noticed he always took a second biscuit when he thought she wasn't looking, and she'd started making extra without mentioning it. Silas was harder to read. He was present and distant at the same time, which she was learning was just his nature. A man who showed up fully for the physical demands of a day and kept the interior parts of himself at a remove that was not unfriendly, just careful. He'd eaten breakfast every morning since she'd started cooking it, which sounds like nothing until you know that Danny had mentioned entirely casually and without realizing what he was revealing, that Silas had barely eaten breakfast at all in the years since Mrs. Rowan passed. She filed that away and said nothing. What she did do was make the coffee stronger. She'd noticed he drank it fast and went back for more, which meant he wasn't tasting it so much as using it, and she thought a man like that might as well get something out of the habit. He noticed the change on the second day and looked at his cup with a slightly startled expression, then looked at her. "Different," he said. "Better or worse?" A pause that lasted longer than it needed to. "Better." That was approximately as much appreciation as she'd learned to expect from him, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was enough. 3 weeks in, the piece started to crack. It didn't announce itself. Trouble at Stone Ridge never did. It arrived sideways through other things, the way weather arrives through a change in the smell of air before the clouds show up. The first sign was the letter. Not Victor Hale's letter. A different one. This one addressed to Silas with a Caulfield County postmark that he looked at for a long moment before opening at the breakfast table. He read it without expression. Folded it. Put it in his shirt pocket. Went about the day. That evening he came to the kitchen after supper cleanup and sat at the table and put the letter down in front of her without preamble. "You should read this," he said. She read it. It was from the county sheriff's office in Caulfield, politely worded, formally composed. And underneath the politeness and the formality, it was a threat dressed in administrative clothing. It stated that a formal complaint had been filed by a Mr. Victor Hale against one Evelyn Mercer regarding the unlawful appropriation of property valued at no less than $300, and that any individual knowingly harboring Miss Mercer could be considered in violation of, and here it got specific in ways that were clearly meant to sound irrefutable, several statutes relating to the obstruction of civil proceedings. Evelyn set the letter down. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes." "He didn't expect me to stay put this long." "No." Silas looked at her. "What do you want to do?" The question surprised her, not because it was strange to be asked, but because of how he'd asked it. Not what should we do or what are our options. What do you want to do? Like her answer was the starting point. "I want to fight it," she said. "I've been running long enough that I've started to forget that running isn't the same as being guilty." She looked at the letter. "But I need you to understand that if you stand behind me on this, it's not going to be quiet. He doesn't back down without cost." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Neither do I," he said. She believed him. That was the thing. She'd met men who said things like that and meant them until the moment the cost became real. And she'd also met men who said things like that and meant them in the bone. Silas Rowan was the second kind. She didn't know how she knew. She just knew. "Then we'll need a lawyer," she said. "I know a man in Grover Falls, name's Aldridge. He's not fancy, but he's good." "Have you used him before?" "Once, when the Henderson outfit tried to claim water rights on my North Creek." Something passed across his face that might have been the memory of a satisfaction. "They didn't claim them long." She nodded. "Write to him." "Already planning on it," Silas said. He picked up the letter and stood. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a long day." She watched him go. He was halfway through the door when she said, "Silas." He stopped. Didn't turn all the way. Just enough. "Thank you," she said. "Again." "Still not the time for it," he said, and went. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, looking at nothing in particular, and thought about how strange it was to be building something inside a place that someone else was actively trying to tear down. How the two things existed simultaneously, the growing and the threat to the growing, and how you had to decide which one to put your hands on. She went to bed and, for once, slept. The second sign came from town. Grover Falls was the nearest settlement of any consequence, about 11 miles south of the ranch, and Evelyn had not been there yet. She'd had no occasion, and several reasons not to. She understood that her presence in the territory was not a secret, and that walking into a town before the legal situation clarified itself was an invitation to the kind of trouble that found her in Tolliston, where she'd been asked to leave a boarding house room she'd paid for in advance because the proprietress had heard her name attached to a story she didn't care to verify. But she sent Danny. Not to do her business, she wasn't that careless, but because Danny was 16 and went to town for ranch supplies every other week. And because Danny was 16, which meant people talked around him like he wasn't entirely there, which meant he heard things. He came back on a Tuesday with flour and fence nails and a look on his face like a man carrying something heavier than flour and fence nails. She caught him before he unloaded. "What did you hear?" she asked. He had the grace not to pretend he didn't know what she meant. "People talking," he said, "at Halloran's store. 2 women I don't know, and Burl Castor. You know Burl Castor?" "No." "He's got the feedlot on the East End, talks more than he thinks." Danny set down the flour with the careful movements of someone choosing words. "They were saying you came here because no one else would have you, that you got run out of 2 counties for theft." He looked at her with a directness that surprised her, given his age. "I know that ain't right. I was there when that writer came. I saw how you read that letter." Evelyn looked at him. 16 years old, sun-browned and watchful, with the kind of moral clarity that hadn't yet been complicated by too many years of having to survive other people's decisions. "What did you say?" she asked. "To them." He shrugged. "Said I work at Stone Ridge, and the cook doesn't steal nothing. Said if they had a problem with it, they could talk to Mr. Rowan." He paused. Burlcaster laughed. Said Silas Rowan must be going soft if he's taking in strays. The word landed with the precision of something thrown. Evelyn kept her face level. "What did you say to that?" she said. Danny picked up the flour again. "Nothing," he said. "I didn't have any more money left to spend there anyway." He carried the flour inside. She stood in the yard for a moment. Strays. She turned the word over, feeling its edge. This was how it went, she knew. The writer first, official sounding and dressed in legal language. Then the social layer, the whispers in stores and at feedlots, the slow erosion of standing that didn't require courts or sheriffs. Just enough people saying a thing enough times that the thing started to feel true, even to people who'd never met her. Victor Hale was not stupid. He'd always been good at this part. She went inside and started dinner and thought about radishes, about things that came up through hard ground because they were going to come up, whether anyone made it easy for them or not. The third sign arrived on a Saturday, and it was not subtle. 3 men on horseback. Not the same rider as before. These were different men, the kind that didn't pretend to have official business. They stopped at the gate and didn't come through it, but they also didn't leave. Just sat there, visible from the main house, visible from the yard, visible from the barn where Silas was working with 2 of the hands on a horse that had been throwing a shoe. They sat there for 45 minutes in the mid-morning sun, doing nothing, saying nothing, which was exactly the point. Cleet came into the kitchen while Evelyn was kneading bread and said, without any identifiable emotion, "There's men at the gate." "I know," she said. "I saw them. Silas knows, too." "I figured." Cleet stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, which was a posture she was learning meant he was thinking rather than being unhelpful. "You know what they're doing," he said. "Seeing if we'll blink." He was quiet for a moment. "This Hale fellow, he's rich." "Yes." "Rich men usually win." "Usually," she agreed. Cleet looked at her. His face was the landscape equivalent of a poker hand. Impossible to read, weathered down to pure function. "You scared?" Evelyn pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. "Yes," she said. "I'm not an idiot." Something moved in Cleet's face. Not a smile exactly, but the territory adjacent to one. He uncrossed his arms, turned around, and walked back out. She heard him cross the yard toward the barn, and a few minutes later she heard Silas's voice. Not the words, just the register, low and deliberate, and then the sound of the barn door. 10 minutes after that, Silas walked to the gate. She watched from the kitchen window, her hands still floury. He walked the same way he did everything, not fast, not slow, the particular pace of a man who's decided something and is now just covering the distance between the decision and the doing. He reached the gate and stood on his side of it, looking up at the three riders, and she was too far away to hear what he said. But she saw the set of his shoulders. She saw the way he didn't put his hands on the gate, didn't lean on it, just stood square and looked up at them. The three riders looked at each other. One of them said something. Silas responded. Another rider said something. She could tell by the way his posture changed that it wasn't friendly. Silas didn't move. At all. Just stood there, and the quality of his stillness from this distance was remarkable, like a fence post that happened to be a man. After a long minute, the three riders turned and rode back down the road. Silas stood at the gate and watched them until they were out of sight. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn without looking at the house, and she thought that was probably deliberate, giving her the privacy of not having witnessed it from too close. She went back to the bread. Her hands had stopped being floury and started being shaky, so she kept them in the dough because the dough needed the working, and the working steadied her hands, and she pressed and folded and turned until both things were true at once. The bread was ready, and she was steady. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. Not an uncomfortable quiet, more like the kind of quiet that settles after a thing has happened and everyone present has decided that what happened deserves a moment of respect before ordinary talking resumes. Danny ate his second helping and looked at Silas with something that was close to awe, which Silas either didn't notice or pretended not to, which Evelyn suspected was the same thing in this case. After the hands had cleared out, she did what she'd stopped stopping herself from doing. She sat at the kitchen table with the account book she'd noticed needed balancing 3 weeks ago and had been quietly correcting one column at a time when she had spare minutes. She wasn't his bookkeeper. She'd never offered to be. But numbers were numbers, and the errors bothered her in the same fundamental way that a crooked picture on a wall bothered her, and so she fixed them. Silas came in for coffee and stopped. "You're doing my books," he said. "Your water rights column has been double-entered since January," she said. "You've been underreporting your actual net by about $60. Silence. "That's," he started. "Significant. Yes." He sat down across from her and looked at the book with the expression of a man who has just discovered a leak he should have found months ago. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," she said. "You didn't." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. She didn't say "you're welcome." That felt like completing a small loop in a way she wasn't ready for. She just nodded and went back to the column. He drank his coffee and didn't leave. And that was the first night they sat in the same room and didn't talk and didn't feel the need to. And that was its own kind of change. Quieter than radishes breaking ground, but no less significant. The letter from Aldridge the lawyer arrived on a Thursday. Silas read it at breakfast, then passed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it. He'd laid out the situation with the directness of a man who charges by the problem, not the hour. The contract Victor Hale had produced had serious structural problems. The debt it referenced was unverifiable. The signature on the father's line was legally questionable without a witnessed affidavit, and the clause regarding personal service as repayment sat in territory that was, in his professional opinion, not legally enforceable and potentially actionable as coercion. But he could do something with this. He'd need Evelyn present. He'd need any documentation she had. And he wanted to understand the full history before he made promises he'd have to keep. She put the letter down. "He's in Grover Falls," Silas said. "We could ride Thursday." Evelyn looked up. "We?" Silas met her eyes. "You shouldn't go alone." She wanted to argue this on principle. She'd been going alone for 4 months. She was capable of going alone. Going alone was sometimes safer than involving other people in the target she was carrying. All of that was true. She knew it. He probably knew she knew it. But she also thought about the 3 riders at the gate, and the letter from the sheriff's office, and the word strays passed around Halloran's store like currency, and she thought, this is no longer just about what you can do alone. This is about what you can afford to. "All right," she said. Thursday came overcast and cool, with a flat gray sky that threatened rain without committing to it, and they rode the 11 miles to Grover Falls with Cleet trailing behind on the grounds that, as he put it, he had to pick up a part for the water pump anyway, and may as well go at the same time. Evelyn suspected this was not primarily about the water pump part, and suspected further that Silas had asked him and Cleet had expressed agreement in whatever minimalist way Cleet expressed agreement. She said nothing about any of this. Grover Falls was a real town in the sense that it had more than 2 streets, which already put it ahead of several places she'd passed through. It had a proper courthouse, a telegraph office, a hotel that looked like it meant it, and enough foot traffic on the main street that arriving in it did not feel like arriving at the edge of something. She had not realized until they rode in how much she'd missed the feeling of a town that had weight to it. Aldridge's office was above the surveyor's on a side street, accessed by an exterior stair that had seen better decades. The man himself was thin in a way that suggested he'd been burning himself as fuel for a long time. Not unhealthy, just optimized down to the essential. He had sharp eyes and the rapid efficiency of someone who never has quite enough time and has made peace with this. He shook Silas's hand, shook Evelyn's hand, not with hesitation, just shook it, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me everything. Not the version you think I need, the whole thing." So she told him. She hadn't told the full version to anyone. She'd been careful about that, the way survivors of bad situations are careful, telling enough to get what she needed in the moment, never enough to hand anyone the whole shape of it. But Aldridge had the manner of a man who found partial information as useful as a broken tool, and she'd gone past the point where careful omission was serving her. She told him about her father's drinking and the debts it generated and the men who'd come around those debts like flies, and how Victor Hale had been one of those men, younger than the rest, better dressed, and fundamentally more dangerous because he understood the difference between force and leverage. She told him about the arrangement her father had agreed to, which she'd known nothing about until Victor had explained it to her in the particular tone of a man who expects explanation itself to constitute consent. She told him about the night she'd said no, about the wrist, about the way a man who smiles while he threatens is worse than a man who shouts. She told him about the accusations, the stolen jewelry, the tampered account books at the household where she'd briefly worked, and how each lie had been precisely calibrated to arrive just ahead of her, like someone with better horses who knew all the roads. She told him about Caulfield and Tolliston and Harker's Bluff and 32 miles of cracked boots. She told him about the document the writer had delivered to Stone Ridge. She told him about the letter from the sheriff. Aldridge listened to all of it without interrupting once, which was a rare and genuine skill. He took notes with a shorthand she couldn't follow. At the end, he sat back and looked at his notes, and then at the ceiling for a long moment. "The contract is the weakest part of his case," he said. "Legally speaking. What he's relying on is the social part, the reputation damage. If people believe the theft story, the legal fight becomes background noise. The real battle's in what the territory thinks of you." "I know," Evelyn said, "which means we have to fight on both fronts." He looked at her. "Are you prepared for the part where this gets worse before it gets better?" She was aware peripherally of Silas being very still beside her. "I've been prepared for that part," she said, "since the first time I ran." Aldridge nodded once. "Then here's what we're going to do." He laid it out, clean, sequential, without softening any of it. They would challenge the contract on 3 grounds. The debt was undocumented, the signature was potentially coerced, and the service clause was legally unenforceable. They would simultaneously begin collecting testimony, anyone who could speak to her character, anyone who had direct experience of Victor Hale's methods in Caulfield County, anyone who had been part of the theft accusation at the household and might tell a different story given the distance from Hale's direct influence. He paused. "The father," he said. "Your father. Where is he?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Caulfield," she said. "Still. Is he capable of testimony?" "He's capable of a lot of things," she said carefully. "Whether he's willing is a different question." Aldridge looked at her in a way that said he heard the history in that sentence and was filing it without pressing. "We'll come back to that," he said. Riding back, the sky had made its decision about rain and was now following through in a committed drizzle that turned the road soft and made the horses irritable. Cleet, who had apparently found his water pump part in under 20 minutes and spent the remaining time in the saloon's front room drinking coffee of all things, rode slightly ahead and slightly to the side in the manner of a man performing the technical operation of not being present in a private conversation. Silas said, after they'd been riding long enough that the silence needed addressing. "You did well in there." "I told the truth," she said. "That's not the same as doing well." "Sometimes it is," he said. She looked at him from beneath the brim of her hat, rain running off the edge of it. His hat was a similar state, his coat darkening at the shoulders, and he looked like a man who was genuinely indifferent to the weather, which she was coming to understand was not performance, but just how he was built. "He's going to find out we went to a lawyer," she said. "I know." "He'll move faster after that." "Probably." She waited to see if this produced any visible concern in him. It did not. "You're not worried," she said. He thought about that for a moment, like he was genuinely taking the question seriously rather than just dismissing it. "I'm worried about the right things," he said. "A man like Hale, he wants you scared. Wants everyone around you scared. That's how he operates. From the fear up. You stop being afraid of him, and he has to do the actual work. And men like that, they don't like actual work." He looked at her. "So I'm not going to be afraid of him. I'm going to be ready for him. That's different." Evelyn looked at the road ahead, the rain coming down soft and steady on the wet Colorado earth. "How do you know what kind of man he is?" she said. "You've never met him." A beat of silence. "I've met men like him," Silas said. "In the war, in business, in the years after Sarah died, when people started circling what I'd built here like it was suddenly available." Something in his voice changed, went slightly harder. "You learn to recognize the ones who think owning things means owning people. They smile the same way, like the other person isn't really in the room." She thought about the smell of whiskey and the cold of a wrist being held too tight. "Yes," she said. "They do." They rode the rest of the way in the rain, and it was not an unhappy silence. The week after the lawyer visit was the week things at Stone Ridge became genuinely good before they became genuinely bad. And looking back on it later, Evelyn would think of it as the week she stopped thinking of herself as a guest and started thinking of herself as someone who belonged to this place, which was both the best thing that had happened to her in years and the thing that made what came next hurt in a different way than hurt had hurt before. The garden had taken hold in a way that exceeded radishes. She'd found seed packets in the storage room that no one had opened since Sarah Rowan's time. Beans, squash, a particular variety of climbing pea that she hadn't seen since she was a child, and she'd put them all in the ground with the specific hopefulness of a woman who has decided that hopefulness is not the same as naivety. Danny had started helping her in the mornings, not because she'd asked, but because he'd shown up one day and started pulling weeds with the focused efficiency of someone who needed to be doing something useful and had found his thing. She let him. She didn't make a ceremony out of it. The kitchen had become the center of the house in a way she could feel but not quite describe. People passed through it differently, not just for food but for the particular quality of the space, which she'd reorganized without drama and which now functioned the way a good kitchen should function as the room where the house came back to itself at the end of the day. Even Silas, who had been eating in the main room, or sometimes not at all, had started eating at the kitchen table more often, with the account books or the day's correspondence, working in the warm, ambient noise of the place, rather than the cold quiet of the room where the single coat hung by the door. She was aware of what this was. She was not naive, but she was also genuinely wary of it, not because she didn't feel it, but because she did, and because trusting something that felt good had been, in her experience, the reliable precursor to losing it. She held it at a small remove. Let herself be present without letting herself lean on it. It was a fine distinction, and she wasn't always sure she was maintaining it, but she tried. The night it cracked open was a Wednesday. She'd stayed up late mending, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary accumulation of torn things that needed attending, and the house had gone quiet around her the way it did after 10 o'clock, that deep country quiet that had no equivalent in any town she'd lived in. The stove was down to coals, the lamp was low. She was nearly done with the last of the mending when she heard footsteps in the hall, and then a pause outside the kitchen, and then Silas came in. He was carrying a telegram, she knew from his face. "Hale," she said. "He's coming." He put the telegram on the table. "Filed formal papers in Caulfield this morning. His lawyer sent notice to Aldridge. He'll be in Colorado by end of next week." He sat down. The telegram sat between them on the table. He He's not sending riders anymore. No, she said. He wouldn't. Not now that he knows there's a lawyer involved. She looked at the telegram. He's coming himself because he thinks that will settle it. He's used to settling things by being in the room. He's going to be disappointed, Silas said. She looked at him. His face was the same as it always was. That particular expression that she'd been studying for 6 weeks and still couldn't entirely map. Serious without being closed, present without performing ease. But underneath it tonight, just visible at the edges, was something tight and set. "You're angry," she said. He seemed faintly surprised. "Yes." "At him or at the situation?" "Both." He looked at the telegram. "Mostly at him." She nodded. "Evelyn." He said her first name directly, not for the first time, but with a deliberateness that made it land differently. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest, even if you think the honest answer is going to change my mind." "All right. Is there anything else? Anything you haven't told me or Aldridge that he's going to use when he gets here?" She looked at him for a long moment, thought about the answer honestly. Not the defensive quick answer, but the real one. The one that required going back through everything and checking. "My father's signature on that contract," she said finally. "I don't know how he got it. My father—" She stopped. Started again. "My father is not a man who would have given it willingly. He's weak in certain ways and has made bad choices, but he loved me. Something about that signature isn't right, and I don't know yet what it is." She paused. "That's the thing I haven't been able to prove, and it's the thing I think Victor's most confident about." Silas was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Then that's what we have to find," he said. "I know." He stood, left the telegram on the table for her in case she wanted to read it again, which she didn't. She heard him walk down the hall, heard the bedroom door close. She sat in the kitchen alone with the dying stove and the low lamp, and thought about her father in Caulfield County, in the house she'd grown up in, with its leaning porch and its smell of old wood and pipe smoke. She thought about his hands, big capable hands that had built fences and shod horses, and held her once when she was small, in the particular safe way of a father who doesn't know he's doing anything important. She thought about those hands signing something under circumstances she didn't know yet. She put out the lamp and went to bed. Outside, Stone Ridge Ranch held its ground in the dark, as it had held ground for years, fences and furrows, and a garden plot coming up strong along the south wall. And in the main house, a man lying awake for the second or third time in 6 weeks, staring at the ceiling with his jaw set, thinking not about fear, but about what came after it. The week before Victor Hale arrived was the best week the ranch had had in 3 years, and everyone on it could feel it, even if no one said so. And that feeling of something good and real and worth protecting was exactly the kind of thing a man like Victor Hale had always known how to use against people. He'd arrived at the edge of their lives again, as he always did, not loud, not rushed, just inevitable in the way of things that have been planned long enough that they start to feel like fate. He was wrong about that, but none of them knew yet exactly how wrong. Victor Hale arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong somehow. Tuesday was an ordinary day. It was a day for fence repairs and flower orders, and the particular domestic rhythm that Stone Ridge had settled into over the past 6 weeks. It was not a day that felt built for a man like Victor Hale, and yet there he was, coming up the road in a hired coach that was too expensive for the terrain, with a lawyer beside him and a second man behind that Evelyn didn't recognize, but recognized the type of immediately. She saw them from the garden. She'd been out there with Danny since early morning, tying up the climbing peas that had gone enthusiastic overnight and needed guidance before they tangled themselves into uselessness. She heard the coach before she saw it, the particular sound of iron-rimmed wheels on packed dirt, faster than a work wagon, more deliberate than a passing rider. She stood up slowly and turned toward the road, and Danny, who had been crouched beside the bean row, stood up beside her. "That's a fancy rig," Danny said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "It is." She watched the coach come through the gate, which someone had left open, and she noted that Victor hadn't stopped at the gate, had not paused to announce himself or ask permission, had simply come through, which was exactly the kind of thing that told you everything you needed to know about a man before he opened his mouth. She put down the twine she'd been holding. "Go find Silas," she said to Danny. "Where is he?" "North Barn. Go." Danny went, at the particular speed of a boy who understands that the speed matters without being told. Evelyn stood her ground in the garden and watched the coach stop in the yard and watched the door open and watched Victor Hales step out. He looked exactly as she remembered. That was the worst part somehow, that he didn't look like a monster because monsters were easier. He looked like a successful man in his mid-40s, well-dressed, well-rested, with the particular physical ease of someone who has never had to carry anything heavy. He had dark hair going silver at the edges, a trimmed beard, and eyes that were a pleasant shade of gray that gave absolutely nothing away. He was the kind of man that people, upon meeting him for the first time, tended to trust immediately, which was the most dangerous thing about him. He looked at the garden, at her. His expression arranged itself into something that was almost warm. "Evelyn," he said, like he was glad to see her, like this was a reunion. She said nothing. He came closer, unhurried, his hands loose at his sides. A deliberate posture, she knew. Men like Victor were always deliberate about their hands. He stopped about 10 feet from her, in the space between the garden and the yard, and looked her over with the considering expression of a man assessing property. "You look well," he said. "Colorado agrees with you. What do you want, Victor?" Not a question. She'd learned the hard way that questions gave him something to work with. He smiled, just slightly. "I want what I've always wanted, a reasonable resolution." He tilted his head. "I have legal standing, Evelyn. You know that. I'd prefer to handle this without the courthouse drama. I think we both know courts are tedious and expensive, and the outcome is rarely worth the process." He paused. "Come back voluntarily. Help me resolve the question of your father's debts, and all of this," he gestured broadly, encompassing the ranch, the garden, the entire situation, "goes away quietly. My father's debts," she said, "are not mine to pay. The contract says otherwise. The contract is fraudulent." Something moved across his face, not anger, not quite, more like the recalibration of a man who'd encountered a variable he'd expected and was now accounting for it. "You've been talking to lawyers," he said. "Rowan's lawyer, I assume, Aldridge." He said the name like he already knew it, which he did. She was certain he did because Victor always knew the names already. "Evelyn, frontier lawyers playing at civil law are not going to be able to— Are you finished?" The voice came from behind her, and she heard the footsteps cross the yard with that particular unhurried pace that she'd learned to recognize over 6 weeks as the specific cadence of Silas Rowan when he'd decided something. Victor turned toward the sound, looked at Silas. Did the assessment with his eyes that he did with everything, quick, thorough, arriving at a conclusion. What the conclusion was, his face didn't show. But she noticed in the half-second before the pleasantness reset, something that she had never seen on Victor Hale's face before. A pause. Silas stopped at the edge of the garden, close enough to Evelyn that his presence registered as deliberate without being theatrical. He looked at Victor with the expression he used for things that required evaluation before response, level, unhurried, giving nothing away. "You're on my land," Silas said. "Didn't catch your name." Victor adjusted his cuffs, a small gesture. She'd seen him do it before when he was recalibrating. "Victor Hale. I have business with Miss Mercer." "Miss Mercer works here," Silas said. "That makes your business with her my business, too." He looked at the coach, at the lawyer still seated inside, at the third man who had positioned himself near the coach door with the specific uselessness of someone hired to look useful. "You're welcome to state it, once." Victor looked at him with the measuring quality of a man who has assessed a great many men and is running the current one through a familiar process. "Mr. Rowan," he said, "I have no quarrel with you. I have a legal claim on Miss Mercer's whereabouts and obligations, filed properly in Caulfield County and now being forwarded through the appropriate Colorado channels. This is a civil matter. I'd encourage you not to make it more complicated than it needs to be." "I'd encourage you," Silas said, "to get back in your coach. Not loud, not aggressive, just flat and certain in the way of someone who means it completely." Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. "We'll talk again," he said to her, "after the courts have had their say." He said it like a promise rather than a threat, which was the distinction that made the back of her neck prickle. He returned to the coach. The lawyer inside shuffled papers without looking up. The third man got up on the box. The coach turned into the yard. Three-point turn, the horses managing it poorly, which gave her a small, uncharitable satisfaction, and went back down the road. She and Silas stood in the yard and watched it go. "He's calmer than I expected," Silas said. "He's always calm," Evelyn said. "That's the point." She looked at where the coach had been. The yard had tire tracks in the dirt now, cutting across the space she'd walked 100 times in 6 weeks. He wasn't here to negotiate. He came to look, to see what he's dealing with. And what did he see? She turned and looked at Silas directly. "That I have someone standing beside me," she said. "He's never had to work around that before." Silas absorbed this. "Good," he said. "Let him work." They went inside. She made coffee because the situation called for something to do with her hands, and because the kitchen was the room where she thought best, and she needed to think. The formal papers arrived from Aldridge 2 days later, Hale's legal filing in full, and it was worse than she'd anticipated, which was saying something given that she'd spent the better part of 6 weeks anticipating. It wasn't just the contract anymore. He'd added 3 additional claims, each one carefully constructed and each one designed to do something specific. The first challenged Silas's right to employ her on grounds that she was, per the disputed contract, under a pre-existing labor obligation, which was creative in a way that made her want to put her fist through something. The second introduced the theft allegations from Caulfield formally into the civil record, attaching what purported to be testimony from 2 former employees of the household where she'd briefly worked. The third was the one that made her sit down. He was claiming damages from Silas, on the grounds that Stone Ridge Ranch had, by employing and sheltering Evelyn, interfered with a lawful civil contract and caused measurable financial harm to his interests. He was asking for a figure that, if awarded, would, she did the calculation twice and got the same answer both times, effectively bankrupt Stone Ridge Ranch. She brought it to Silas that evening, laid it on the table, watched him read it. He read it the same way he read everything, thoroughly, without visible reaction, with the patience of a man who understands that reacting to paper is a waste of energy better spent on the response to it. When he finished, he set it down and flattened it with his palm the way he'd flattened the first letter, that same gesture that she'd noticed before. "He's going after the ranch," she said. "I see that." "This wasn't—" She stopped, started again. "This was about me, my situation. You're not the one who—" "Evelyn," he said it quiet. "I know what he's doing. He's trying to make me cut you loose, make this too expensive for me to keep standing here." He looked at her. "I'm not going to do that. You could lose everything." "I could." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she heard how serious he was being, not performing certainty, not dismissing the risk, but naming it clearly and choosing anyway. "I've lost things before. Lost the most important thing I had 3 years ago, and I'm still here." His jaw worked once. Stone Ridge is worth fighting for. So is this. This landed between them, and neither of them moved toward it or away from it. It sat there, specific and unnamed, while the lamp burned and the stove settled. "We need to tell Aldridge tonight," she said finally. "Already wrote the letter," Silas said. "Need you to add what you know about those 2 witnesses he produced. The ones from the Caulfield household." She looked at him. "You already wrote it." "I write fast when I'm angry," he said. She picked up a pen. She wrote for an hour. All of it. The 2 women Victor had listed as witnesses, what she knew of them, the circumstances under which they'd worked in the household, the specific thing that one of them, a woman named Clara Briggs, had said to her in a back hallway 2 days before the accusations surfaced. Clara had said, in a low and frightened voice, "He's going to say you took the necklace. I know you didn't. I don't know what to do." And then Victor had appeared at the end of the hallway, and Clara had gone quiet and looked away, and 2 days later Evelyn had been accused and Clara's name had appeared on the complaint as a witness to the theft. She had not told this to Aldridge because she had been afraid that it sounded like desperation, like the kind of story an accused person tells to redirect blame. But she was done being afraid of how things sounded. She wrote it all down. Sent the letter with Cleet the next morning, who rode to Grover Falls with the purposeful efficiency of a man who has decided that this errand matters and is not going to waste Silas Rowan's time on it. Aldridge's response came back in 4 days, which was the fastest she'd ever seen a lawyer move, and it told her something about how seriously he was taking it. He'd found Clara Briggs. She was not in Caulfield County anymore. She was in a town called Reston, about 40 miles east, where she'd gone 6 months ago after leaving the Hale household's sphere of influence. She was working as a seamstress. She was, according to Aldridge's careful language, willing to speak with him. Whether she was willing to testify was a different question that remained to be answered. But she existed. She was findable. And she was not, apparently, as securely in Victor Hale's pocket as he believed. Evelyn read that part of the letter 3 times. The 4th day after the papers arrived was also the day that Grover Falls stopped being a place that had opinions about Evelyn Mercer at a comfortable distance and became a place that had opinions about her close up. She'd gone in with Silas, not for the lawyer this time, just for supplies that needed choosing in person, and because hiding from the town was starting to feel like conceding something she hadn't agreed to concede. They were at Halloran's store when it happened, or rather, when a portion of it happened, the part that was visible, the part she'd understand the full weight of later. A woman she didn't know stopped in the middle of the store floor and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has made a decision in advance and is now executing it. "You're the woman from Stone Ridge," the woman said. Not a question. Not friendly. "Yes," Evelyn said. "My cousin lives in Caulfield County." The woman had the careful voice of someone who has rehearsed this. "She says you're known there for dishonesty." The store had gone quiet. Halloran himself had stopped moving behind the counter. There were 4 or 5 other people present, all of them now attending to the conversation without appearing to. Evelyn looked at the woman. She was perhaps 60, stout, with the righteousness of someone who has appointed herself to a task. Evelyn had faced this before. In Tolliston, in Harker's Bluff, in variations and gradations. The faces changed. The script stayed roughly the same. She had 2 choices. She'd always had 2 choices in these moments: deflect or speak. She was done deflecting. "Your cousin heard a story," Evelyn said. "That story was started by a man named Victor Hale, who is currently in the process of filing fraudulent legal claims in a Colorado court, which is what happens when the truth doesn't cooperate with what a person wants it to be." She kept her voice even. Not combative, just clear. "I didn't steal from him or anyone else. I walked away from a man who thought an illegal arrangement made me his property. If your cousin knows the name Hale, I'd ask her what she knows about him, not what he says about me." Silence. The woman's expression had shifted through several states during this and arrived somewhere that was not quite retreat but was no longer advance. Silas, beside her, had not moved or spoken. His presence had done something that presence can do when it's the right kind. It had occupied the room in a way that made a certain quality of escalation feel inadvisable. Halloran cleared his throat. "I'll get those flour sacks, Miss Mercer." She looked at him. He was not looking directly at her, but his posture had changed, something in it that suggested he'd made an adjustment, the way people sometimes do when they've been watching and have seen enough to revise. "Thank you," she said. They left the store with their supplies and didn't speak until they were mounted and moving out of town. "You didn't have to say all that," Silas said. "Yes," she said. "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "You did." The hearing was set for the following Thursday. Aldridge had filed the response to Hale's claims and requested an expedited hearing on the grounds that the damages claim against Stone Ridge Ranch constituted an ongoing threat to a functioning business and warranted prompt resolution. The judge, a man named Carver, about whom Aldridge said only that he was methodical and did not like theatrics, which Aldridge seemed to consider a recommendation, had agreed. The 3 days before the hearing were the longest Evelyn had spent since the days immediately after leaving Caulfield. Not because of inaction. There was plenty to do, letters to write, documents to organize, the ordinary work of the ranch that didn't stop for legal proceedings. But because of the specific quality of waiting that comes when you've done everything you can do and must now let events move at their own pace. She found herself in the garden more than usual. Not because there was more garden work, there was, but not unusually so, but because the garden was one of the few places where effort and result were transparently related. You put seeds in ground. You tended them. They grew or they didn't, but at least the relationship between your actions and the outcome was direct, which was not how courts worked. Danny worked beside her without asking why she was in the garden so much. He developed the useful quality of being present without requiring explanation, which she suspected was natural temperament rather than acquired wisdom. In either way, she appreciated it. On the second evening, Silas came out to the garden at a time he wouldn't normally. He stood at the edge of it, and she could tell from the way he was standing that he had something to say and was organizing it, which he did, she'd noticed, more carefully than most men. He didn't speak impulsively. Whatever came out of his mouth had been through some internal process first. "Clara Briggs is coming," he said. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. Aldridge reached her? Rode to Reston himself, apparently. She agreed to testify. He paused. "She's afraid, according to Aldridge. But she's coming." Evelyn sat back on her heels in the dirt. The evening light had gone golden and long, the way it did this time of year on the Colorado high ground, and the garden smelled like wet earth and the particular green smell of things growing fast. "Did he say why she changed her mind?" she said. Silas looked at her. Apparently she said she'd been waiting for someone to ask the right way. He paused again. Aldridge said he just told her the truth about what was happening, about what Hale had filed, about the damages claim against the ranch. Another pause. "About you walking here." Evelyn looked at the bean row for a moment. "She doesn't even know me," she said. "No," Silas agreed, "but she knew what she'd seen." She nodded slowly. The bean row needed tying. She picked up the twine and did it, and Silas stood at the edge of the garden for a while, not leaving, not speaking, just there in the way he was sometimes simply there, which she had stopped finding strange and started finding the most reliable thing in her current world. "Silas," she said, without looking up from the beans. "Yeah. If this doesn't go the way we need it to, it will. But if it doesn't," she tied the twine, moved to the next plant. "I want you to know that you gave me something I didn't have before. The standing to fight." She tied another knot. "That matters. Whatever happens." He was quiet long enough that she looked up. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did, the thing she'd been learning to read for 6 weeks without ever quite finishing the translation. Something careful and present, and not entirely closed anymore. "You gave yourself that," he said. "I just didn't get out of the way." She looked at him for a moment, then went back to the beans. He went back inside. She stayed in the garden until the light ran out. The morning of the hearing, Evelyn woke before 4. Not from a bad dream, from a certainty, the kind that arrives fully formed when the mind has been working through the night on a problem the waking self hadn't finished solving. She lay still for a moment, identifying it. Her father's signature. She'd said to Aldridge and to Silas that something about it was wrong. She'd said she didn't know what. That had been true then. But lying in the dark of the room off the kitchen at 4 in the morning, something had finished assembling itself that she needed to say out loud before it slipped. She got up, put on her coat, went to the main room where she'd seen Silas's lamp burning late the night before and, on a guess, knocked on the study door. A pause. Then, "Come in." He was awake. Dressed, actually. He'd been up, maybe all night, she couldn't tell. He looked at her with the specific alertness of someone who had not been sleeping. "The signature," she said. "My father doesn't write in pen. He can't. His hands shake from the drink, have for years. He uses a pencil for everything, traces over it if he has to sign formal things. Whatever's on that document is in pen." She looked at Silas. "A clean, steady pen signature. That's not my father." A silence. "You're sure?" Silas said. "I've been sure for weeks. Sure. I didn't trust it because it sounded like what a desperate person would say." She looked at him. "It's not desperation. It's true. And Aldridge needs to know before we walk in there." Silas was already on his feet. "We leave in an hour," he said. "We'll stop at Aldridge's office first." She went to get ready. Moving through the dark house, past the kitchen where the stove was banked low and the smell of yesterday's bread still lived in the walls, past the window that looked out on the garden where things were growing in the dark without anyone watching. She felt the particular quality of a moment that is not yet resolved, but has stopped being something you're waiting to survive and started being something you're moving toward. That was different. That was entirely different from anything the past 4 months had felt like. And she held it carefully as she dressed, the way you hold something you don't want to drop. Grover Falls's courthouse was not a large building, but it was a serious one, stone-fronted, with the particular weight of a place that has been used to decide things and has absorbed that purpose into its walls. They arrived with 40 minutes before the scheduled hearing, which gave Aldridge exactly enough time to absorb what Evelyn told him about the signature, ask 3 rapid clarifying questions, and disappear into the records room with a purpose that suggested he knew how to use this. Victor was already there. Of course he was. He was in the corridor outside the courtroom with his lawyer, a man from Denver, well-dressed in the manner of someone who charges enough to make the dressing worth it, and 3 people Evelyn didn't recognize who had the look of witnesses prepared in advance. Victor saw her across the corridor and nodded, almost pleasantly, and she looked at him for exactly 2 seconds and then looked away. Silas was beside her. He didn't look at Victor at all. Cleet was there too, which surprised her. He was sitting on a bench along the corridor wall in his good coat. She didn't know he had a good coat, with his hat in his hands, and he looked up when they came in and gave her the approximately a nod that constituted his version of encouragement. "You didn't have to come," she said. "Water pump part came in," he said. "Had to pick it up anyway." She looked at him. He looked at his hat. "Thank you, Cleet," she said. He put the hat on the bench beside him and didn't reply, which meant he'd heard her. The courtroom itself was smaller than she'd imagined it. Not a grand chamber, just a working room with benches, and a raised bench at the front where Judge Carver sat, with the economy of motion of a man who has heard a great many things and does not intend to be surprised by any of them. He was perhaps 60, thin, with reading glasses he took on and off with the frequency of a man who has made peace with needing them. He called them to order at 9 sharp. No preamble, no ceremony beyond the minimum. He stated the claims before the court with the directness of someone who finds his own time valuable, and then he looked at both parties and said, "We'll hear the evidence, sequentially, without theater. Is that understood?" Not a question. "Yes, Your Honor," said Victor's Denver lawyer. "Yes, Your Honor," said Aldridge. Judge Carver put on his reading glasses. "Proceed?" Victor's lawyer went first, and he was good. She had to concede that. He laid out the debt claim with a precision that almost made it sound reasonable, produced the contract with the signature, and had it entered into evidence, and presented his 2 witnesses from the Caulfield household in a way that was organized and internally consistent. The witnesses, neither of them Clara Briggs, said what they'd been arranged to say with the specific cadence of people who have rehearsed under pressure. When Aldridge's turn came, he stood up with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has been waiting for this exact moment. He called Evelyn first. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the room, Silas in the gallery, Cleet, hat now in his lap, the judge's glasses reflecting the window light, Victor at his table, pleasant and still. She told the truth, all of it, every word of it. She had rehearsed nothing. Aldridge had specifically told her not to rehearse because rehearsed people sound rehearsed, and so it came out in the order it happened, with the gaps and the imprecisions and the occasionally wrong turn of phrase that real memory produces. She did not cry. She had not planned to cry, and she did not. Not because she wasn't afraid or wasn't tired or wasn't carrying the weight of 4 months of running, but because fear and exhaustion do not always produce tears, and sometimes they produce the opposite. Victor's lawyer cross-examined her. He was skilled. He tried 3 angles, and she answered each of them with the calm of someone who has nothing to unsay because she only said what was true. Then Aldridge called Clara Briggs. She was smaller than Evelyn remembered, or maybe the distance of months had made her larger in memory. She was perhaps 40, with nervous hands that she pressed flat on her thighs when she sat down, and she looked at the room with the expression of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has decided that the fear is no longer a reason not to speak. She spoke. She said what she'd said in that back hallway, not verbatim, but in substance. She said she had not seen Evelyn take anything. She said she had been told what to say in her witness statement by a man on Victor Hale's payroll who had made the consequences of noncompliance very clear. She said she had given that statement in fear and had been living with it since. Victor's lawyer objected. Multiple times. The judge sustained 2, overruled 3, and once told the lawyer to sit down with a patience that had very clearly run out. Then Aldridge produced the contract. He did not produce it dramatically. He just placed it before the court, and asked the judge's permission to direct attention to the signature line, which the judge granted, and then he said plainly, "Your Honor, the defendant contends that this signature was produced under circumstances that call its validity into question. Specifically, that the signatory, Miss Mercer's father, has, due to a long-standing medical condition affecting his hands, been unable to produce a pen signature of this quality for a number of years, and that all formal documents he has signed in recent memory have been in pencil, with pen overlay only when witnessed." Aldridge paused. "We are prepared to bring 2 residents of Caulfield County who have witnessed Thomas Mercer sign documents in this period, and who will corroborate that this signature is inconsistent with his known hand." Victor's lawyer stood up fast. Victor himself, for the first time since she'd known him, for the first time in years, showed something on his face. Not fear, not quite, but the particular expression of a man who has run a calculation and arrived at an answer he did not expect. Judge Carver took his glasses off, put them on the table, looked at the room with the eyes of a man who has been deciding things for a long time and knows what a turning point looks like. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," he said. "Mr. Aldridge, I want those witnesses available this afternoon. Mr. Hale's counsel." He looked at the Denver lawyer with a steadiness that was not unkind but was entirely certain. "I suggest you use the recess to review your client's position." He left the bench. The courtroom exhaled. Evelyn sat in the witness chair for a moment after the judge had gone, not because she'd forgotten to move, but because she needed the moment. The wood of the chair was solid under her. The room was solid. The morning light was coming through the high window at the angle it does in late morning, real and specific and not going anywhere. She looked across the room. Silas was looking at her. He had the expression on his face that she'd been learning to read for 6 weeks, and she'd finally finished translating it, or enough of it, the part that said, "I knew." The part that said, "I told you." The part underneath both of those that said something she wasn't ready to name out loud yet, but recognized the shape of. She looked away first, but she was almost smiling when she did. The 30-minute recess lasted 47 minutes, which told Evelyn something. She'd learned, in the years of navigating situations where powerful men made decisions behind closed doors, that extra time was never neutral. Extra time meant either that something had gone wrong for the side that needed things to go right, or that something had gone unexpectedly right for the side that had been losing ground. She sat on the bench in the corridor outside the courtroom with her hands flat on her thighs. She'd picked up that habit from Clara Briggs without realizing it, or maybe they'd both learned it from the same necessity. And she waited. Silas sat beside her, not touching, just there, which was enough. Cleet was down the corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, apparently asleep, except that his boots were pointed toward Victor Hale's end of the corridor in a way that seemed deliberate. She couldn't be sure. With Cleet, you were never entirely sure. Victor and his Denver lawyer had disappeared into a side room immediately after the recess was called. She'd watched them go. Victor had walked with the same unhurried ease he always walked with, but his lawyer had been moving faster than his client, which was an inversion of their morning dynamic and meant something. Aldridge came and sat beside her during the recess, not to confer, but to be present. He had a particular quality when cases were in motion, a kind of coiled stillness, like a man conserving what he'd need later. He'd said almost nothing since the judge left the bench. "The witnesses from Caulfield," Evelyn said quietly. "You said this morning you had them." "I have affidavits," Aldridge said. "2 neighbors of your father who've signed legal statements attesting to his hand. One of them is a notary who witnessed him sign a property tax document last spring. Pencil, with pen tracing, witnessed and dated." He paused. "If it comes to this afternoon, I put them on the stand. But I don't think it comes to this afternoon." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because the Denver man is smart enough to see where this goes," Aldridge said. "A forged signature opens a criminal investigation. That's a different jurisdiction, different stakes. His client hired him for a civil proceeding, not to be present at the collapse of a fraud case." He turned the pen in his hand slowly, once. "He'll be advising Hale to consider his options right now." "Victor doesn't consider options," Evelyn said. "He makes other people consider theirs." Aldridge looked at her. He did, he said. Past tense is going to apply here whether he likes it or not. She wanted to believe that. She did believe it mostly, but she'd spent 4 months believing that truth was enough and finding out that truth needed help, needed lawyers and witnesses and a rancher who wouldn't step back. And so she held Aldridge's confidence at a slight angle, using it without resting her full weight on it. The courtroom door opened and a clerk indicated they were resuming. They filed back in. Victor and his lawyer were already at their table when Evelyn entered, and she watched Victor as she walked to her side. Something she never did. She always avoided looking at him directly if she could, but she needed the information his face might give her right now. He was looking at the table. Not at her. Not at Silas. Not performing pleasantness. That was new. Judge Carver came back in, sat down, arranged his papers with the efficiency of a man who has arrived at a position and is now stating it. He put on his reading glasses. Before we continue, he said, I have a communication from counsel for the plaintiff requesting a brief conference with the court and opposing counsel in chambers. He looked over his glasses at the room. I'm going to allow that conference. We'll reconvene afterward. Miss Mercer, Mr. Rowan, you may remain in the courtroom. A pause that had the quality of something left unfinished on purpose. Or step outside. Your preference. They stepped outside. Evelyn stood in the corridor, and for a moment the adrenaline that had been carrying her since 4 a.m. shifted into something else. Not relaxation, not relief, just a different kind of alert. The kind that comes when you've been running downhill and the ground has leveled out, but your legs haven't caught up yet. Danny was there. She hadn't seen him come in. He was on the bench at the corridor wall, hat in his hands, looking at her with the complicated expression of a 16-year-old who has ridden 11 miles alone because he wanted to be there, even though no one had invited him, and wasn't sure if that was right. She looked at him. Who's at the ranch? Jenkins and Morrow, he said, naming 2 of the older hands. I asked them to stay. I hope that's... I just thought... It's fine, Danny, she said. Thank you. He exhaled, put his hat on the bench. Silas looked at the boy and then at Evelyn, and something about the look said he'd known Danny would come, or at least hadn't been surprised by it, and had said nothing because there was nothing to say. The boy had made a choice. It wasn't a wrong one. They waited another 23 minutes. Evelyn knew because she counted, not obsessively, just the way you count things when your hands have nothing to do and your mind needs an anchor. When the courtroom door opened and the clerk indicated they could return, Aldridge came out of chambers first, ahead of Victor's lawyer, which told her the sequence of what was about to happen before any words did. Aldridge's face was controlled but not sealed. Something behind his eyes had the quality of a man who has just watched something he built hold the weight it was designed to hold. He sat down beside Evelyn and said, very quietly, without looking at her, "The damages claim against the ranch is being withdrawn." She looked at him. "All of it," he said. She turned to face forward before her expression could become something she'd have to manage in public. Judge Carver settled at the bench, put his glasses on, looked at Victor's lawyer, who rose. "Your Honor, after further review of the evidentiary record and in consultation with my client, the plaintiff is withdrawing the damages claim against Stone Ridge Ranch as filed." A pause in which the lawyer's professional neutrality did some heavy lifting. Additionally, the plaintiff is requesting a continuance of the primary contract claim pending further review of the documentation. A continuance, not a withdrawal. She knew the difference. A continuance meant he wasn't letting go, just releasing the pressure temporarily, reorganizing, buying time. Aldridge rose before she could process whether this was better or worse than she'd hoped. "Your Honor, the defense would oppose a continuance on the grounds that the primary claim, like the withdrawn damages claim, is predicated on documentation whose validity is now materially in question. We would request that the court make a finding on the contract itself today. Given that the plaintiff's own action in withdrawing the damages claim suggests acknowledgement that the evidentiary foundation is compromised." Silence. The specific kind of courtroom silence that means the room is thinking. Judge Carver took his glasses off, set them on the bench, looked at Victor Hale with the direct and undecorated assessment of a man who has been watching people make decisions in his courtroom for 20 years and has gotten good at reading what those decisions mean about the people making them. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, "you're the plaintiff. I'd like to hear from you directly on one question, if your counsel will permit." He paused. "The contract in question. You're confident in its validity?" Victor's lawyer started to rise. The judge held up one finger. Victor rose instead. This was the first time she'd seen him stand in this courtroom. He'd been seated the entire morning, operating through his lawyer the way powerful men often do, present but insulated, letting the machine work. Standing, he was exactly himself, composed, well-dressed, with the weight of a man accustomed to rooms turning to him. He looked at the judge with a steadiness that Evelyn knew from experience was not the same as honesty. It was the performance of steadiness, and Victor had been performing it for so long he probably couldn't tell the difference anymore. "I'm confident in the claim," Victor said. "The debt is real. The arrangement was agreed upon." Judge Carver was quiet for a moment. "The signature on the contract," the judge said. "You witnessed it yourself?" A pause. Barely a beat, but she caught it. "My representative was present," Victor said. "That's not what I asked," the judge said. Another pause. Longer. "I was not present at the signing," Victor said carefully. "Who was?" "My business manager at the time, a man named—" "Where is he now?" "He no longer works for me." Judge Carver put his glasses back on. "Mr. Aldridge," he said, without looking up from whatever he was writing. "Your opposition to the continuance is noted. I'm going to take the contract validity question under advisement, and I want both parties back in this courtroom in 10 days with any additional evidence they intend to present regarding the signature's authenticity." He did look up now at the full room. "I'm also directing the county clerk to flag the contract documentation for review by the district attorney's office, as the questions raised this morning regarding its origins may have implications beyond this civil proceeding." Victor's lawyer was on his feet. "Your Honor." "Sit down, counselor," the judge said. Not unkindly. Just with the specific finality of a man whose patience has a shape and they've reached its edge. The district attorney's office operates independently of this court's findings. I'm not making a finding. I'm noting a question. That's my prerogative. He closed the folder in front of him. 10 days. We're adjourned." He left the bench. The room moved. Victor's lawyer was at his table gathering papers with the focused urgency of someone who needs to have a conversation with his client immediately and privately. Victor himself stood for a moment, just a moment, and in that moment Evelyn, who was watching him because she needed to know what they were dealing with next, saw something cross his face that she'd never seen there in all the years she'd been afraid of him. He looked briefly like a man in a room that had stopped having the right dimensions. Then it was gone, and he was buttoning his coat and turning toward the door, and his lawyer was beside him speaking quietly and quickly, and they were moving, and then they were out of the room and the door was closing behind them. She sat still for a moment. Aldridge put a hand briefly on the table between them, not touching her, just a gesture that said, "This is what I said it would be." He was already organizing his papers. 10 days, she said. 10 days, he confirmed. He'll either push forward or he won't. The district attorney referral changes his calculations significantly. Civil claims are manageable. Criminal investigations into document fraud are not. He looked at her. He built his whole life on the civil side of things. The criminal side is a different room with different furniture. Silas said from beside her, "What are the odds he pushes forward?" Aldridge considered this with the honesty of a man who charges for accuracy, not comfort. "Lower than they were this morning," he said. "I won't say 0 because this type of man has ego, where other people have good sense. But lower." He closed his bag. "Go home. Rest. Come back in 10 days. She stood. Her legs felt strange. Not weak, just unfamiliar. Like a person who's been holding a weight so long that putting it down changes the whole architecture of how you're standing. Cleet was at the door. He looked at her, gave the nod, and went out ahead of them. Danny was on his feet and trying not to look as relieved as he was, with limited success. They walked out of the Grover Falls courthouse into the afternoon, which had turned warm while they were inside. One of those Colorado turnarounds where the morning is gray and the afternoon arrives like it was a different day's idea entirely. The main street was going about its business. A dog crossed the road. Two women came out of the dry goods store. Life in a town that doesn't stop for courtrooms. Silas stood beside her on the courthouse steps and looked at the street for a moment. "You all right?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. Which was true. He nodded. "Fair enough." They rode home in a loose group, Silas, Evelyn, Cleet slightly ahead, Danny slightly behind, the particular formation of people who have been through a concentrated thing together and need the physical space of not quite talking yet. The afternoon light ran long and gold across the Colorado landscape, the kind of light that makes the mountains look like they've been there since before everything and will be there after, which was either comforting or not depending on how you felt about things being larger than yourself. The ranch came into view around the last bend, and Evelyn felt something when it did. Not dramatic, not a swelling, just a recognition. The particular quality of a place becoming familiar in the bone, the way certain things stop being things you notice and start being things you simply know. She'd felt this before, in the house she'd grown up in, before the debts and the drinking and the slow unraveling of everything that had seemed permanent when she was small. She'd thought she'd left the capacity for it behind somewhere on the road between Caulfield and here. Apparently not. The 10 days were the strangest of her time at Stone Ridge. Not because they were eventful, they mostly weren't, at least on the surface. The ranch work continued, the garden continued, the kitchen continued. Danny, who had returned from Grover Falls with the particular energy of a young person who has witnessed something important and needs to process it by working very hard, threw himself into the fence repairs on the east side with a commitment that resulted in the best mended fence line the ranch had seen in years. Cleet observed this without comment, and once, passing the fence line, stopped and looked at a stretch of Danny's work for a long moment with the expression of a man doing reluctant arithmetic that ends in a favorable answer. What was strange was the texture of the waiting. It had a different quality than the waiting before the hearing. Before, she'd been waiting for something to happen to her, for Victor to arrive, for the court to convene, for the next thing in the sequence of things being done to her life. This waiting was different. She'd done something now. She'd stood in a room and told the truth with her name on it, and the ground hadn't opened up, and the thing she'd built here hadn't collapsed, and Victor Hale had stood in a courtroom and for once had not controlled the room. She caught herself, twice, starting to plan things. Spring planting. A repair to the south wall of the garden that she'd been noting since the second week. Small things, forward-facing things, the kind of things you plan when you've started to believe in a future that contains the place you're in. She stopped herself both times, not out of superstition, but out of caution. Victor hadn't folded yet, but the planning kept starting. On the 6th day, a letter came from Aldridge that was not about the case. Or rather, it was about the case, but from a direction she hadn't anticipated. He wrote that the district attorney's office had, as the result of Judge Carver's referral, made an inquiry into Victor Hale's records in Caulfield County. This had produced, apparently, not just questions about her father's signature, but evidence of 2 additional civil arrangements that bore similar structural irregularities. Contracts signed under disputed circumstances by people who were financially distressed, each one carrying debt repayment terms that crossed lines the law had drawn a while ago and Hale had apparently been comfortable ignoring. One of the other parties was still in Caulfield County. One had left, but left a paper trail. Aldridge's letter was careful about what he said and how he said it, because he was that kind of lawyer. But between the careful lines, what it said was, "This is bigger than your case now." She read it twice. Then she handed it to Silas and went to start dinner because she needed to do something with her hands and her head at the same time. He came into the kitchen while she was halfway through the bread, read the letter at the table, set it down. "He's done this to other people," Silas said. "Yes," she said. She'd suspected, had told Aldridge she suspected, but suspecting something and seeing it documented were different weights. "How long?" Silas said. "I don't know." She worked the bread. "Long enough that he got comfortable. Long enough that he stopped being careful about it." She paused. "Men like that, they stop being careful when it's worked enough times. They start thinking they're just better at it than everyone else." Silas was quiet for a moment. The other people he did this to. What about them? Someone's going to need to be the first one. He looked at her. You already are. She stopped kneading, looked at the dough, looked at the wall above the stove where a small discoloration in the plaster had been bothering her for 3 weeks, and she kept meaning to address it, and hadn't yet. She thought about that. The small, ordinary, unfinished things that accumulate in a place where you live, that you only accumulate if you're staying long enough to notice them. I know, she said. She went back to the bread. He stayed at the table for a while, not asking anything else, just present in the kitchen the way he'd been present in it more and more. Not helping, not in the way, just there in the particular way that people who have stopped being strangers occupy shared space. The 9th day was when her father arrived. She did not know he was coming. No letter, no warning, just the sight of a wagon coming up the road at mid-afternoon, driven by a man she didn't recognize, and in the back of the wagon, sitting upright with the careful posture of a person who has made an effort, was Thomas Mercer. He was older than she remembered, not older than time would make him. She'd done that math and knew what 4 months plus the years before it should look like. Older in a different way. The kind of older that happens when something a person has been carrying gets heavier than they thought it was going to get. She was in the garden when the wagon came through the gate. She stood up, set down the trowel, wiped her hands on her apron. Did not move toward the gate, not immediately, because she needed a moment between seeing him and walking toward him, needed to find some interior arrangement that was not anger and was not grief and was not the complicated love that had no clean name. She was still working on the arrangement when Silas appeared from the direction of the barn. He took one look at the wagon, then at her, and stopped. He had the instinct for reading situations that came from years of managing a ranch and managing people, and he read this one correctly without being told anything. He didn't approach, didn't retreat, just stopped and let whatever was going to happen have the space it needed. Her father climbed down from the wagon with the care of a man whose body had opinions about the movement, and he was thinner than she'd expected. And when he turned and saw her across the yard, his face did something that made the arrangement she'd been building dissolve before she'd finished it. He looked ashamed. Not the performed shame of a person caught at something, the real kind, the kind that has been sitting in a man for a while and has changed the shape of him from the inside. She crossed the yard. They stood facing each other. He had his hat in his hands, which was a posture she'd never seen on him. He was a man who wore his hat, always, inside and out, as if taking it off cost him something. The hat was in his hands. "Evie," he said. His voice had roughened. Not from drink, or not just from drink, from something else. "Papa," she said. Just that. Just the word. He closed his eyes for a moment. "I didn't," he started. Stopped. "The signature. I want you to know I didn't. He told me he just needed me to acknowledge the debt. Said it was a formality. I signed." He looked at his hands. "I signed what he put in front of me. I didn't read it. I've been reading it in my head every day since you left, and I didn't—" He stopped again. "He told you it was a formality," she said. "Yes." "And you believed him because you needed to believe him." A silence. "Yes," he said, very quiet. She looked at him, 58 years old and thin, and carrying the hat, and looking at her with the eyes of a man who has been doing accounting of a kind that doesn't involve money and has arrived at a number that's hard to live with. He was not a villain. He had never been a villain. He was a man who had made 100 small bad choices across 20 years that had accumulated into a situation that a villain had then used. There was a difference. She'd been angry at the difference for 4 months, and she was still angry, and she was also looking at her father standing in this yard with his hat in his hands. "Why are you here?" she said. "Aldridge wrote to me," he said. "Told me what was happening, what's happened." He looked at the ground, then back at her. "He said my testimony about the signature, about what I was told when I signed, would help." He paused. "I want to help. If you'll let me." Another pause. "If you'll let me even be here." She looked at him for a long moment. "You can stay the night," she said. "We have room." She said it like that, matter of fact, without ceremony, which was its own kind of answer. Dinner's at 6. She turned and went back to the garden. She heard him exhale behind her, a long, shaking exhale that she pretended not to hear and that she would think about later when she was alone. Silas, across the yard, met her eyes when she looked up. She gave him a short nod. He turned and went to speak to her father's driver about where to put the wagon, which was exactly the right thing to do and required no discussion between them, which told her, not for the first time, something about the kind of man he was. Dinner that night was the fullest the kitchen table had been. Thomas Mercer sat at the end, across from Cleet, who assessed him with the same efficient inscrutability he assessed everything. And Danny, who had never learned to hide his reactions, alternated between curiosity and the particular effort of a young person trying to appear as if they are not paying close attention to something they are paying very close attention to. Silas sat where he always sat. Evelyn served the food she'd made. Nothing elaborate, the ordinary dinner she'd have made on any ordinary evening, and sat down, and they ate. Her father was quiet. He ate with the careful attention of a man who's been reminded that food is something worth noticing. He said almost nothing until Cleet, of all people, asked him in a flat voice where he'd come from, and he said Caulfield County, and Cleet said Long Road, and her father said yes, and that was apparently enough of a conversation for Cleet, who went back to eating. After dinner, after the hands had cleared out and Danny had done the washing up with more than usual care and gone to the bunkhouse, after Silas had excused himself to the main room with the account books, Evelyn and her father sat at the kitchen table with the stove warm and the night dark outside. She made coffee, set a cup in front of him. "Tell me about the signing," she said. "All of it. What he said, what you understood, what it looked like." She looked at him. "I need to know what Aldridge is going to hear when he puts you on the stand tomorrow." Her father wrapped both hands around the cup. He told her. All of it. The meeting in the study of the Hale house, the business manager with the papers already prepared, the language her father didn't fully understand and was told not to worry about, the feeling of a man who is in debt and afraid and has been told that this signature will make the pressure stop. The way Victor had been in the doorway at the end, not in the room, technically not present, watching with the same pleasant expression she'd seen him wear 100 times. She listened. She asked 3 questions, clarifying questions, the kind Aldridge would ask. Her father answered them. When it was done, the coffee was cold, and the stove had settled into its night sound, and the kitchen was very quiet. "I should have been braver," her father said, "about all of it, for years." He looked at his hands, the hands that couldn't hold a pen steadily anymore. "I should have protected you." She looked at the table, at the wood grain she'd been looking at for 2 months, the particular pattern she knew now the way she knew the garden plot, the way you know the surfaces of a place you've decided to inhabit. "You're here now," she said. "Not forgiving, not yet. Maybe not for a long time because some accounting takes longer than a night. But not closing the door either because some doors once closed, stay closed, and she'd had enough of closed doors." He nodded. She took both coffee cups to the sink and washed them. The 10th day came with high thin clouds and a cold that was still morning cold when they rode into Grover Falls, the 5 of them, Silas, Evelyn, her father in the wagon, Aldridge meeting them at the courthouse, Cleet with his water pump part from 4 weeks ago that he still apparently needed to return for, which said everything about why he was actually there. The courtroom was the same room. The same benches, the same high window, the same judge's bench with the same man behind it settling his glasses. But the room had different people in it and different weight. Victor was there. His Denver lawyer was not. A different man sat beside him, local, less expensive, less polished, which told its own story about what the 10 days had cost. Aldridge set up with the efficiency of a man who has been doing this long enough to know that preparation looks like confidence without being performance. He'd been in correspondence with the district attorney's office. He'd spent the 10 days doing exactly what he'd told them he'd do. Judge Carver called them to order. The morning unfolded the way that mornings do when the weight has already shifted and everyone in the room knows it, except possibly the person most invested in denying it. The 2 Caulfield County witnesses testified about Thomas Mercer's handwriting, straightforward, documented, unimpeachable. The notary produced the property tax document with its pencil and pen overlay, witnessed and dated, 7 months before the contract's alleged signing date. Thomas Mercer himself sat in the witness chair with his hat in his lap and told the truth about what had happened in that study, slowly and clearly, with the particular credibility of a man who is confessing his own failure in the process of exposing someone else's. Victor's new lawyer cross-examined him. He tried 3 angles. None of them found purchase, because Thomas Mercer had nothing to hide in his own testimony. His culpability was already in the room, already stated, and there was nothing underneath it to expose. Clara Briggs was not called again. Aldridge had saved her testimony from the first hearing, and it was already in the record. He referred to it twice. Victor's lawyer objected once. The judge overruled it without looking up. At 11:30, Judge Carver put down his pen. "The court finds the contract as presented to be invalid," he said. His voice had the matter-of-fact quality of a man reading weather from a reliable instrument. "The signature's authenticity is not established by the evidentiary record, and the testimony regarding the circumstances of signing indicates that even if the signature were genuine, the agreement was obtained through material misrepresentation." He looked at his papers. "All claims arising from this contract are dismissed with prejudice. The earlier withdrawal of the damages claim against Stone Ridge Ranch stands." He took off his glasses. "Given the district attorney's active review of related documentation, I'm directing that the original contract and all evidentiary copies be held by the court pending that review." A pause. "Mr. Hale, you're free to go. I'd suggest you speak to your counsel about the district attorney's inquiry." He did not say this with particular emphasis. He didn't need to. He left the bench. For a moment, the room just breathed. Evelyn sat very still. The dismissal with prejudice. All claims. She knew what the words meant. She'd asked Aldridge to explain them 3 times in the past week, not because she didn't understand them, but because she'd needed to hear them enough times that her body would believe them when the moment came. Her body was beginning to believe them. Beside her, Silas let out a long, slow breath that was the only sound she'd heard him make in 2 hours that wasn't words. Across the room, Victor Hale stood and buttoned his coat with the same hands that had held her wrist once in a hallway, and told her she belonged to him. He did not look at her. His new lawyer was speaking to him quietly, and he was listening with the expression of a man receiving information he has decided not to fully accept yet. He walked toward the door. His new lawyer followed. At the door, he stopped. She thought he was going to turn around. She thought he was going to look at her. He'd always been the kind of man who needed the last look, who needed to leave the room still feeling like the center of it. He didn't turn. He walked out. The door closed. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she looked at the high window where the thin clouds had moved since morning and the light had shifted to the particular brightness of late Colorado morning. Then she looked at Aldridge, who was writing something and did not look like a man who needed to be congratulated because he was already thinking about the next problem. "It's over," she said. She wasn't asking. "The civil case," Aldridge said without looking up. "The DA's review will take longer. You may be called to speak to that." He paused. "But the claims against you and against the ranch—" "Yes." "Over." She nodded. Her father was sitting 3 rows back. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression that had no single name, relief and regret, and something older, the particular look of a parent who has witnessed their child survive something the parent contributed to. She held his gaze for a moment, nodded once. He pressed his lips together and nodded back. Not absolution, not yet, but something. She stood up. Silas stood beside her. They walked out of the courtroom and into the corridor and then out of the courthouse and down the stone steps into the Grover Falls afternoon. Cleet was on the steps. He'd apparently not gone in at all. "Done?" he said. "Done," Silas said. Cleet looked at Evelyn, gave the nod, picked up the water pump part, which had been sitting on the step beside him. "Ride back when you're ready," he said, and went to get his horse. Danny appeared from around the side of the building. He'd been there, apparently, the whole morning, unable to go in and unwilling to go far. He looked at their faces, and his own face did the thing it did, transparent and immediate, the open relief of someone who hadn't practiced hiding it yet. "We won?" he said. "We won," Evelyn said. He let out a sound that wasn't quite a word and sat down on the step like his legs had decided independently that standing could wait. She looked at him and felt something that was almost like affection, and was also, she suspected, a form of gratitude for his uncomplicated presence, for showing up without being asked, for being 16 in a way that made everyone else around him slightly more willing to feel what they felt. Silas stood beside her on the steps, looking at the main street of Grover Falls going about its Tuesday business, the dog crossing the road and the women at the dry goods store, and the ordinary persistence of life in a place that didn't stop for anyone's legal proceedings. "What do you want to do?" he said. It was the same question he'd asked her weeks ago at the kitchen table when the sheriff's letter had arrived. She'd noticed he kept asking it, kept handing the question back to her, not because he had no opinion, but because he understood somehow that she'd spent a long time in a situation where no one had thought to ask. "I want to go home," she said. She said home without thinking about it. Without the small, careful pause she'd been putting before it for 2 months, the pause that had been her way of acknowledging that it wasn't hers yet, that she was on provisional ground, that everything could still be pulled away. She said it, and it landed where it was supposed to land, and no one corrected her. Silas looked at her from the side. His face did the thing it had been doing more often lately, the thing she'd finally translated, or mostly translated, the thing that she'd been holding at a careful distance for weeks and was finding now more difficult to hold that way. "Good," he said. They went to get their horses. The ride back from Grover Falls took longer than usual because nobody was in a hurry. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed, the absence of urgency. For 4 months she had been moving through the world with the specific physical tension of someone who does not know when the next bad thing is coming, but knows it is coming. And that tension had become so familiar she'd stopped registering it the way you stop registering the weight of a coat you've worn all winter. Riding back through the Colorado afternoon with the courthouse behind her and the ranch ahead, she noticed the tension's absence the way you notice a sound that has finally stopped. The quiet where it had been, the unfamiliar lightness of it. Danny rode ahead, talking to nobody in particular, which with Danny meant he was processing something by converting it into motion and noise, and she let him. Her father's wagon rolled along at the pace wagons set for themselves, Thomas Mercer sitting upright on the bench, with the particular stillness of a man who has said what he needed to say and is now living in the space after it. Cleet was Cleet, somewhere adjacent, present, but not intrusive, carrying his water pump part back from wherever he'd had it leaning all morning. Silas rode beside her. They didn't talk much on the road. They hadn't needed to talk much for a while, which was a thing she'd noticed gradually, and then all at once, the way you notice gradual things. The silence between them had changed texture over the weeks, from the careful silence of strangers managing a shared space to the functional silence of people working the same operation, to something else that she didn't have a clean word for, but that felt like the conversational equivalent of not having to knock before entering a room. She was thinking about what came next. Not anxiously, just thinking, the way you think when the emergency has passed and the ordinary future opens back up, and you have to remember how to look at it. "The garden's going to need attention," she said. Silas looked at her. "That's what you're thinking about." "Among other things." "The peas?" "The peas are fine. The squash is getting aggressive on the south end. I've been letting it go because there were other things to deal with." She paused. "I should have dealt with it 2 weeks ago." He was quiet for a moment. "You were slightly occupied." The squash didn't care. He made a sound that was the closest thing she'd heard from him to a laugh. Not quite. More like the audible acknowledgement that something was funny, which from Silas she'd learned to receive as the equivalent of a full laugh from another person. She'd been collecting these without intending to, storing them up. "Evelyn," he said. The way he said her name had changed over the weeks, too. She'd noticed this also. In the beginning, it had been functional, a way of starting a sentence that needed her attention. Now it had weight to it, the specific weight of a word that has been used carefully enough that it starts to mean more than its dictionary definition. She looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead. He had the expression he got when he'd been working on something internally and had arrived at the point where the working was done and the saying had to happen. She'd learned this expression. It came before the most important things he said. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer it the way you actually feel, not the way you think you're supposed to feel, or the way that seems reasonable, given how long you've been here. He paused. Do you understand what I mean by that? Yes, she said. Do you want to stay? She looked at the road ahead. The ranch was visible now around the long bend. The gate posts, the sign, the particular configuration of buildings she'd been looking at every day for 2 months, and that had rearranged themselves in her mind from a place she was tolerated into a place she knew. The garden plot along the south wall, the kitchen window, the second porch step that still cracked when you hit it wrong and that she kept meaning to fix. I want to stay, she said. Not as the cook, he said. Careful, making sure the words were right. Not as someone working off an obligation. I mean, he stopped, started again, which she'd almost never heard him do. I mean here, as a person who is here because she wants to be here and because... Another stop. Because I want her here, specifically. He was looking at the road with the intensity of a man who is being braver than he's comfortable being and has decided to do it anyway. That's the question. She looked at his profile, the jaw that had been set against so many things in the months she'd known him, the hands on the reins, steady, capable, the hands of a man who had held a ranch together alone for 3 years and not let it go to pieces even when he probably wanted to. The particular angle of his shoulders that she'd learned to read the way you learn the weather on a specific piece of land. What it means when they're like this, what it means when they're like that. She thought about the night she'd knelt beside the bunk in the room off the kitchen, the prayer she'd thought no one heard, the things she'd asked for that she hadn't had a name for at the time, not safety exactly, not rescue, but something more fundamental than both. The chance to stop running, the chance to build something instead of just surviving the destruction of things, the chance to be known by a place and by people in it and to know them back. She hadn't known what that would look like when she asked for it. This was what it looked like. Not perfect, not without history or complication or the specific awkwardness of 2 people who had been careful with each other for months and were now being asked to stop being careful. Not without the fact that she still had a father with a complicated accounting between them and a legal review that might call her back to Grover Falls, and a name that some people in the territory would take another season to stop associating with a story that wasn't true. None of that was resolved. She knew that. But he was asking her a real question, and she had a real answer. Yes, she said. Specifically. He exhaled. It was a quiet sound, the kind that carries a great deal in a small space. He didn't reach for her hand or say anything poetic about it. He just nodded, once, and looked at the road, and something in the set of his shoulders changed. Not noticeably, not dramatically, just the particular shift of a man who has been carrying something a long time and has found the right place to set it down. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch in a silence that was not like any of the previous silences. Warmer, more settled, like a room after someone has finally found the source of the draft and fixed it. The gate was open when they arrived. Jenkins had left it open in expectation of their return, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. The ordinary assumption of people belonging to a place and coming back to it. She rode through without stopping. Her father stayed 3 more days. He slept in the spare room off the main hallway, the room that had been used for storage since Sarah Rowan's time, and that Evelyn had quietly cleared out 3 weeks into her stay because unused rooms in a working house bothered her the same way the crooked account columns had bothered her. They were fixable, so she fixed them. He ate at the kitchen table with everyone else, and he was quiet in the useful way rather than the closed-off way. And he helped with the things he could help with, which, at his age and condition, were not the physical things, but were the noticing things. He was, she remembered now, a man who could sit still and watch, and eventually say the one useful thing when he was sober enough to access it. On his second evening, he sat with her in the kitchen after dinner, just the 2 of them. The same table, the same lamp, the same stove. He's a good man, her father said. He meant Silas. He didn't need to say the name. Yes, she said. Better than I gave you in the beginning. He said it looking at his hands, not at her. The accountability of it was direct and not decorated, which she appreciated. He'd always been more honest about his failures than about his intentions, which was something, even if it wasn't everything. "You're here now," she said again. The same thing she'd said in the yard when he arrived. She meant it the same way. Not forgiveness as a completed act, but forgiveness as a direction. A thing she was moving toward rather than a thing she'd arrived at. He looked up at her. "I know it's not enough," he said. "What I did in Grover Falls, testifying, I know that doesn't... Papa..." She said it with the particular tiredness of someone who doesn't have energy for the performance of reconciliation and wants the real thing or nothing. "I'm not keeping score. I don't have the stamina for it anymore." She looked at him directly. "But I need you to be honest with me going forward, about everything. If you're in trouble, if someone's pressuring you, if something is wrong, you tell me before it becomes something we're all living inside of." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I'll do that." She nodded. "Good." She poured him more coffee. He took it with both hands the way he'd taken it the first night, like warmth was something to hold on to. They didn't resolve everything that night. You don't in one kitchen with one pot of coffee. Some things between a parent and a child take years to move through, and some of them never move all the way. And you learn to live alongside them instead of waiting for the final accounting. What they did was begin, the real beginning, not the version of beginning that is actually just politeness, but the one where both people have said something true and difficult and are still in the same room after. That counted for something. She'd learned the long way that beginning was not nothing. He left on the third morning with the same wagon and the same driver and the particular posture of a man carrying less than he'd arrived with, which was the right direction, even if the load wasn't gone. She stood at the gate and watched the wagon go, and did not cry, which she'd expected, and did not feel the specific chest heaviness of unresolved things, which she hadn't. She felt, instead, the particular clarity of someone who has looked at a hard thing directly and found that it did not destroy her. That was worth something, too. She turned around and went back to the squash. The district attorney's review took 6 more weeks. It was not Evelyn's fight to run in those 6 weeks. It was the legal apparatus moving through its own process, with Aldridge involved and the Caulfield County authorities involved, and at least 2 other families whose situations had now surfaced. She was called twice to Grover Falls to give supplemental statements, which she gave, and she answered every question fully and without the self-protective hedging she'd been practicing for months. The truth had worked once. She was done hedging it. Victor Hale did not appear in her life in those 6 weeks. She heard about him through Aldridge, heard that his presence in Caulfield County had become complicated, that the 2 families whose contracts were under review had come forward with their own testimony, that the business manager who had been in the room when Thomas Mercer signed was now speaking to investigators, apparently having decided that loyalty to a sinking enterprise was not a life goal he could sustain. Men like Victor Hale operated on the assumption that everyone else's silence was purchasable. What they consistently underestimated was the cumulative weight of other people's self-respect, the fact that people who had been frightened into silence were often just waiting for evidence that the silence could be broken without the roof falling in. When Evelyn had stood up in that courtroom and told the truth, she hadn't just been fighting her own case. She'd been demonstrating something, and other people had watched the demonstration. She thought about this sometimes in the garden, or in the kitchen, or in the long Colorado evenings that had turned from cool to warm as the season shifted. About how the one person who refuses to run can change the shape of a thing. Not because they're braver than everyone else. She'd been afraid every day of the past months, afraid in ways she hadn't admitted to anyone, including herself, but because the refusal, the simple stubborn act of staying and speaking, creates a before and after. Other people can locate themselves in relation to it. She didn't think of herself as a person who had done something important. She thought of herself as a person who had run long enough and then stopped. The stopping was the thing. Everything else grew out of that. The news about Victor came on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the courtroom. Aldridge sent a letter rather than writing out himself, which she understood. It was his professional mode, the letter, and she'd come to recognize that what he communicated by letter he'd considered carefully, and what he said in person he considered urgent. A letter, in this case, was the right vehicle for something that needed to be read rather than received. She read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up. The district attorney's office had filed criminal charges against Victor Hale. 2 counts of fraud, 1 count of coercion, and a 4th charge she had to read twice because she'd never seen the specific legal language used to describe what it was, an attempt to enforce an illegal labor arrangement through misrepresentation. The 3 other families whose situations had come to light were named in the filing. The business manager had turned fully, and his testimony was cited as central to the case. At the bottom of the letter, in Aldridge's spare professional hand, was one sentence that was not strictly necessary from a legal standpoint, and that she suspected he had written anyway because he was, underneath the efficiency and the billing, a person. The name Evelyn Mercer appears nowhere in this filing as a defendant, an associate, or a subject of inquiry. It appears only as the name of the individual whose testimony initiated the process that led here. She set the letter down. She sat with it for a while. The kitchen was quiet. The stove's early sound, the particular pre-dawn quality of a house before it starts its day. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edge where the ridge line met the dark. The garden was out there in the almost dark, growing without anyone watching it, the way things grow when you've given them what they need and then gotten out of the way. She got up, started the coffee, started the biscuits, let the ordinary morning begin. Silas came in at his usual time and found her at the stove and found the letter on the table, which she'd left there deliberately, and read it without being told to. She heard the particular quality of his silence while he read, the kind that gets denser as it goes, not emptier. When she turned around, he was looking at her. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He put the letter down and it joined the layered history of things that had been placed on that kitchen table. Victor's first document, the sheriff's letter, the lawyer correspondence, the telegram. All of it sitting in the past now in the sequence of things that had happened and been moved through. The table still the table, the kitchen still the kitchen. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about that honestly, the way she was trying to think about things now. Not the quick automatic answer, but the real one, which sometimes required a moment to locate. "Like the ground stopped moving," she said. "I keep waiting for it to start again, and it doesn't." She looked at him. "That's strange, after a while, when the thing you've been braced for just stops." He nodded. He understood this. She knew he did, not from her situation specifically, but from his own, the 3 years of learning to live after the most important loss of his life, the slow work of rebuilding a self that had been organized around a partnership that was suddenly gone. He'd never told her the whole of it. She'd never asked, not directly. But she'd been watching him for months, and the shape of it was in everything he did. The single coat by the door, the kitchen he'd kept clean but empty, the way he ate breakfast now at the table that he'd stopped eating at for 2 years, and the way he sometimes paused in the middle of a task, with the expression of a man checking something internal and finding that it had changed from what it was last time he checked. He was healing. She was healing. They were doing it in the same house, on the same land, which was not a plan either of them had made but had somehow become the arrangement. "There's something I want to show you," he said. She looked at him. "Now?" "After breakfast." He said it with the slightly self-conscious quality of someone who has planned a thing and is not practiced at planning things. "It'll keep that long." She turned back to the biscuits. "All right." After breakfast, after the hands had cleared out, and Danny had gone to the fence line with the focused energy he'd maintained since Grover Falls, as if the whole experience had given him a project that was larger than fence posts but expressed itself most naturally through fence posts, Silas led her to the north end of the property. Past the barn, past the water trough he'd been meaning to repair, past the point where the cultivated land gave way to the rougher ground at the property's edge. There was a stretch of land there she hadn't seen from this angle. She'd ridden past it twice, but riding past and standing in are different things, and standing in it now she could see what he'd been seeing. It was good land. Sheltered by the ridge on the north side, well drained, with a quality of light in the morning that was different from the main ranch yard, softer, more contained. The soil, where she crouched and picked up a handful, was dark and workable in a way that the harder ground of the south garden was not. She stood up and looked at it. "This was cleared 2 seasons before Sarah got sick," he said. He was standing a few feet away looking at the land rather than at her. "I had plans for it. Buildings, maybe. Didn't get to it. He paused. It's just been sitting. She looked at the land. She thought about the things she'd been turning over in her head in the weeks since the courthouse. Not anxiously, just thinking, the way you think when the future opens back up and you start to want things again. She'd been cautious about wanting things. It had seemed like a dangerous habit to return to. She was returning to it anyway. We could build something here, she said. Yes, he said. That's the idea. She looked at him. He was looking at her now, with the expression she'd learned and translated and still found, each time, more than she was fully prepared for. Steady and serious, and containing something she'd been holding at a careful distance for months, because it was large and real, and she had not trusted until recently that real things lasted. What kind of something? She said. Whatever you want it to be, he said. More garden, outbuildings, a place for... He paused, choosing. For people who need a place. He said it simply, without architecture. He didn't build speeches. He said the essential thing and let it stand. You've been thinking about it. I've seen you thinking about it. She had been. The other families the DA's filing had named, she'd thought about them. Clara Briggs in Reston, alone with her needle and her thread and the weight of having been frightened into silence. Her father in Caulfield, thin and carrying his hat and trying to be useful. The unnamed others who had been through versions of what she'd been through. The specific experience of having a powerful person decide that your life was a resource for their purposes. She'd been thinking about them in the way she'd thought about the unused seed packets in the storage room, as something that could grow, given the right conditions, and someone willing to do the work. Yes, she said. I've been thinking about it. Then let's build it, he said. As if it were that simple. Knowing it wasn't, but saying it that way anyway. The way you commit to something before you've worked out all the details. Because if you wait for all the details, you never start. She looked at the land again. The light was fully up now, the thin clouds from earlier burning off, the kind of Colorado morning that felt like the landscape making an argument for itself. The ridge to the north, the open ground between, the particular quality of silence that isn't empty but full of birds and wind, and the distant sound of the ranch beginning its day. We'll need more fence, she said. Cleet's already ordered the posts, Silas said. She looked at him. You talked to Cleet before you talked to me. Cleet's easier to talk to about fence posts, he said. And there it was again. The almost laugh, the audible acknowledgement, the thing she'd been collecting. You're harder to talk to. In the good way. She looked at the land for another moment. Then she looked at him. Ask me the question, she said. The real one. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass on the north end of the cleared land. Somewhere behind them, in the direction of the barn, a horse expressed an opinion about something. The morning went on being the morning, indifferent and beautiful. Stay, he said, not as the cook, not as the person running the kitchen, as my partner. He held her gaze with the steadiness that she'd come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but its opposite. The presence of something so significant, it required all his composure to hold it. In the ranch, in whatever we build here, in a pause, the kind that is not hesitation but precision, the right word requiring location, in everything. She thought about 32 miles of cracked boots, about a gate she'd pushed open not knowing what was on the other side of it, about the room off the kitchen and the prayer she'd thought no one heard, about radishes breaking through hard ground because they were going to, regardless, about a man who had heard something in the dark and stood at a door and then walked away and changed his whole life anyway. She thought about the fact that she was standing on this land and it felt like ground under her feet in the specific way that some ground does and some ground never does, no matter how long you stand on it. The difference between a place you are and a place you belong. Yes, she said, to all of it. He crossed the distance between them with the same economy of movement he applied to everything. No wasted motion, no performance. And he took her hand, which was still slightly dirty from the soil she'd picked up, and she hadn't thought to wipe it first. And he held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. They stood there for a while. The land stretched out around them. The morning went on. No music, no ceremony, no one watching. Just two people on a piece of ground they were going to build something on, holding the particular silence of people who have said the things that needed saying and are now simply present in what comes after. The following months shaped themselves differently than the months before. Not easily. Nothing about a working ranch is easy, and nothing about two people learning to share a life after years of being separately broken is easy either. There were mornings when the old habits of guardedness returned without warning, when Evelyn would catch herself in the kitchen with the specific posture of someone ready to leave, and have to consciously put that posture down. There were evenings when Silas retreated in ways she'd learned to recognize as grief, rather than withdrawal. Moments when the weight of missing Sarah came back in the unpredictable way grief does. Not as a failure of the present, but as evidence that the past had been real. And she'd learned to give those moments their room without taking them personally, which was itself a kind of skill that required practice. They built the north structure in stages, starting with the fencing Cleet had already ordered, then the foundations, then the walls. Danny turned out to have a talent for construction that nobody had previously identified, including Danny, and he threw himself into it with the same focused energy he'd applied to fence repair and gardening, which suggested he was simply a person who needed to be building something and had been waiting for someone to give him the right materials. Clara Briggs came in the late summer, not because anyone pressured her to. She wrote to Evelyn first, a letter that was careful and a little formal, from Reston, asking if there might be work at the ranch of any kind. She wrote that she'd been following the legal proceedings and had spoken twice more to the district attorney's office, and was finding that Reston, though she'd chosen it for its distance from everything, was not a place she was building anything in. She wrote that she didn't know exactly what she was asking for, but thought she'd ask. Evelyn wrote back and told her there was a room and work enough for anyone willing to do it. Clara arrived in September, thin and careful in the way of someone who has been managing a very small life very precisely, and she stood at the gate in a way that Evelyn recognized from the inside, the posture of a person who has walked a long way and is not entirely sure the gate will open. Evelyn went out to meet her at the gate instead of waiting for her to come through it. It was a small thing. It cost nothing. And Clara Briggs exhaled when she saw her coming, a sound that Evelyn had made herself, months ago, in a kitchen, in the dark. And something in her face changed from tight to almost possible. "You came," Evelyn said. "You said there was room," Clara said. "There is," Evelyn said. "Come in." By the first frost, there were two others. A woman from one of the families the DA's filing had named, who arrived with a 14-year-old daughter and the specific competence of a person who has survived something difficult and kept their skills intact through it. A man, unexpected and yet not, in retrospect, who had worked for years for Victor Hale's household operation in a capacities that had trapped him as surely as it had trapped anyone, and who had given testimony and found that giving testimony left you without employment in a territory where Hale's name had reached everywhere. Silas hired him for the horses, which was where his skills were, and nobody made a ceremony of it. Stone Ridge Ranch was not a grand operation by the end of that year. It was not a spectacle or a mission or an institution. It was a working ranch that happened to have more people on it than before, people who had come for different reasons and stayed for the same one, because it was a place where what had happened to them was known and not used against them, where the work was real and the food was good, and the garden along the south wall was coming back from 2 abandoned seasons into something a person could be proud of. Victor Hale was convicted the following spring, 2 counts of fraud, 1 of coercion. His legal empire in Caulfield County was by then substantially dismantled. Other creditors, emboldened by the public proceedings, had come forward, and the weight of accumulated claims had done what the individual claims couldn't. He was sentenced in a Caulfield County court on a Thursday in April, and Evelyn heard about it from Aldridge's letter, and she read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, and then put it in the box where she kept important documents and went out to the garden because the early beans needed attention. She did not feel triumphant. She'd been asked later by Clara what it felt like when the news came, and she'd thought about it honestly before answering. "Like putting down something I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten I was carrying it," she said. "Not like winning, more like finishing." Clara had nodded. She knew about carrying things. What Evelyn had won, she understood now, was not the case. Cases were decided by courts. What she had won, or built, or chosen, the verb was imprecise because the thing itself was imprecise, was harder to name. It had to do with the version of herself that came out the other side of it. Not untouched, not without scars, not delivered into some clean version of a life she'd imagined before everything went wrong. But intact. Still herself, or a better version of herself. A version that had been tested at the specific joints where people tend to break and had found, not that she was unbreakable, but that she was the kind of person who could be bent nearly to the ground and still grow back vertical. The radishes were still growing. Every season. She kept planting them. On a Saturday evening in May, the kind of evening that Colorado seems to produce specifically to remind you why you stayed, warm, the light going long and golden, the ridge throwing its shadow slowly across the yard. Silas found her in the garden, doing the last of the late planting. He sat down on the low stone edge of the plot she'd built up along the south wall and watched her work. "Aldridge's letter," he said. "I know," she said. She kept her hands in the soil. "I read it." "You didn't say anything." "I needed to think about it first." He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things about him that she had come, over the months, to recognize as a form of respect, the willingness to let a person find their own words rather than filling the space before they could. "It's over," she said. "The whole thing, his appeals, his delays, all of it." She patted soil around the last seed. "It's done." "How does that feel?" She sat back on her heels, looked at the garden, at what it was now compared to what it had been when she'd first found it, choked with weeds and abandoned. The climbing peas were already up on their strings. The radishes were coming. The squash had been persuaded back to its proper end. It was not a perfect garden. It had the specific imperfections of something tended by multiple hands with different ideas, which meant it was slightly more interesting than a perfect garden. "It feels like enough," she said. "That's the best I can say for it. Not everything I wanted when I was in the middle of it. Not justice in the big, clean sense. Just enough. Enough that I can look at the rest of my life instead of backward at that." Silas nodded. He was looking at the garden too, then at her. "Marry me," he said. Not a speech, not framed in any particular way. Just the sentence, plain, with his eyes on her and the May evening going on around them. She looked at him. She thought about the first night, about standing at this ranch's gate with cracked boots and a name everyone believed was dirty, asking for a chance. About the way he'd opened the door and stood in the frame and looked at her and made a decision that had nothing to do with what was safe and everything to do with what he'd heard in her voice when she said, "I can do the job." About everything that had been built between then and now. Not romantically built, not without difficulty, but built the way real things are built, with the wrong tools sometimes and the wrong weather, and days when you couldn't see the shape of what you were making, and then days when you could. She thought about the prayer she'd whispered in the dark of the room off the kitchen, in what she'd believed was total privacy, asking for something she didn't know how to name, and the man on the other side of the wall who had heard it and made a decision in the dark about what kind of person he was going to be. She looked at the garden. She looked at the ranch. She looked at the ridgeline going purple in the evening light and the first stars beginning to show above it. "Yes," she said. Simple as that. Simple as radishes through hard ground. Simple as a gate pushed open by someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to find. He reached over and took her hand, still dirty from the garden, same as always, and they sat on the stone edge of the south wall plot in the May evening while the light ran out. And around them, Stone Ridge Ranch continued its ordinary, extraordinary life. The sound of the barn, the smell of the kitchen coming from the house. Clara's voice somewhere in the distance explaining something to the young daughter of the woman who'd come in the fall. Danny whistling off-key near the north structure. Cleet moving through the yard with the specific economy of a man who has decided where he is and stopped looking for anywhere else. None of them were undamaged people. All of them had arrived at this place through something that had tried to finish them. What the ranch had given them was not healing in the simple sense, not the erasure of what had happened, not a return to who they'd been before. It had given them a place to be what they'd become instead, which is a different and more sustainable gift. The The stars came out fully. The light was gone. Evelyn Mercer, who would be Evelyn Rowan before the summer was out, who had walked 32 miles through the Colorado wilderness to knock on a stranger's gate, who had been called a thief and a runaway and a stray, and had answered all of it by simply staying and speaking and doing the work, sat in the garden she'd brought back from abandonment and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely name, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was easy, not because it was perfect, but because she'd chosen it and fought for it, and it had held. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.